Today, I've prepared the biography of Oprah Winfrey. Before you fall asleep, make sure to tell us from where you're listening and what time it is. Now, calm down and listen to the story while falling asleep. I'm wishing you a cozy and comfortable night. As you settle into your soft pillows and pull your blankets close, let your mind drift with me to the humble beginnings of one of the world's most influential women. Oprah's journey is one of resilience and transformation, a gentle reminder that our dreams can carry us to extraordinary places. Her voice has comforted millions, much like these words hope to comfort you now as you gently close your eyes. The soft rhythm of your breathing will guide us through her remarkable story, from rural Mississippi to becoming a beacon of inspiration across the globe. Let the tension melt from your shoulders as we begin this soothing tale together. In the quiet stillness of Kosciuszko, Mississippi, on a gentle winter day in January of 1954, a child named Oprah Gail Winfrey entered the world. The soft Mississippi air carried whispers of both hardship and hope as this little girl, who would one day become known simply as Oprah, took her first breaths in a landscape still deeply divided by segregation and inequality. The rural South of the 1950s moved at its own unhurried pace, marked by the slow changing of seasons and the steady rhythm of agricultural life that had defined the region for generations. Oprah's early years unfolded on her grandmother, Hattie Mealy's farm, a simple place where the connection to the earth was immediate and essential. Imagine, if you will, the tender scene of a young child following her grandmother through the garden rows, learning the patient wisdom that comes from tending growing things. Hattie Mee, a woman of remarkable resilience and quiet strength, became Oprah's first teacher in life's most fundamental lessons. Under the spreading branches of old trees, on a porch where shadows lengthened with the setting sun, Hattie Mee taught her granddaughter to read before she had even reached the age of 3. The farmhouse where they lived was modest, lacking many of the conveniences that other Americans were beginning to take for granted in the post-war era. There was no running water, and the gentle flicker of oil lamps illuminated their evenings together. Yet within this simple setting, something extraordinary was taking root. The relationship between grandmother and granddaughter created a nurturing space where Oprah's natural intelligence and curiosity could blossom like the flowers in Hattie Mee's garden, opening slowly but with inevitable beauty. Those early years had a dreamlike quality, with days that stretched out endlessly under the warm southern sun. Young Oprah would often perform for the farm animals, using corn cobs as makeshift dolls, and reciting biblical verses that her grandmother had lovingly taught her. The rural church became another formative influence in her life, its hymns and rhythms seeping into her consciousness, teaching her about the power of voice and storytelling long before she understood where these gifts might lead her. The farm's isolation created a kind of protective cocoon around the young girl, could not shield her forever from the complexities of the world beyond. When Oprah was 6 years old, the gentle fabric of her life with her grandmother was altered as she moved to Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to live with her mother, Vernita Lee. The transition from the unhurried pace of rural Mississippi to the faster rhythms of urban life represented a profound shift in her young existence. The northern city, with its colder climate and unfamiliar patterns, must have seemed like another world entirely to a child whose earliest memories were formed in the warmth of the South. Life with her mother presented new challenges. Vernita worked long hours as a housemaid, often leaving before dawn and returning after her daughter had already fallen asleep, her dreams perhaps carrying her back to the farm and her grandmother's soothing presence. The apartment they shared was small and located in an impoverished area of the city, where the 1950s economic boom that was transforming middle-class American life seemed a distant reality, while other families were moving to newly built suburbs, enjoying the fruits of post-war prosperity. Vernita and Oprah navigated a more precarious existence on the economic margins. These were difficult years, unfolding against the backdrop of a nation experiencing both tremendous growth and painful division. The civil rights movement was beginning to gain momentum, though its greatest triumphs still lay ahead for a young African American girl in Milwaukee. The promises of equality remained largely unfulfilled promises, existing more in rhetoric than in daily reality. Despite these challenges, Oprah's remarkable intellect continued to develop. She learned to find comfort in books, those gentle companions that asked nothing of her, but offered windows into worlds beyond her immediate circumstances. Words became her refuge, stories her sanctuary. The local library, with its hushed atmosphere and endless shelves of possibilities, became a place where she could temporarily escape the difficulties of her home life and lose herself in narratives that expanded her understanding of what might be possible. When Oprah was 9 years old, another significant transition occurred as she went to live with her father, Vernon Winfrey, in Nashville, Tennessee. This move represented yet another adjustment, another landscape to navigate, but it also brought a measure of stability that had been lacking in her life with her mother. Vernon, who worked as a barber and would later become a city councilman, provided structure and emphasized the importance of education in a way that would profoundly influence his daughter's future path. The household Vernon maintained with his wife Selma was one where books were valued and academic achievement was expected. Here, Oprah found an environment that nurtured her natural gifts and encouraged her to develop them further. The soft evening hours often found her reading aloud or engaging in discussions about ideas that children her age were rarely invited to explore. In this atmosphere of intellectual curiosity, Oprah's confidence began to grow like a plant, finally receiving the light it needs to thrive. Nashville in the 1960s was a city experiencing the gradual, sometimes painful process of integration. The civil rights movement had gained momentum, and the old structures of segregation were beginning to yield, though not without resistance. Against this backdrop of social change, Oprah attended Wharton Elementary School, where her intelligence and verbal abilities quickly distinguished her from her peers. Teachers noticed the girl who spoke with unusual clarity and confidence, who seemed to absorb knowledge with effortless ease. By the time she reached East Nashville High School, Oprah had developed into a student whose academic promise was impossible to ignore. She joined the speech team, discovering in formal oratory an outlet for the expressive abilities that had first manifested when she recited Bible verses for her grandmother's farm animals years before. The teenage Oprah began to collect honors and recognitions, small affirmations that hinted at the larger recognition that would come in future years. It was during these high school years that Oprah secured a job at WVOL, a local radio station, marking her first professional connection to the media world that would eventually become her domain. Imagine the young woman, not yet 20, her voice flowing into the microphone with a natural warmth and authenticity that listeners responded to immediately. There was something in her tone, something in her way of speaking that made people feel as though she was addressing them personally, creating an intimate connection across the invisible waves of radio transmission. When Oprah was 19, another opportunity appeared on her horizon. She was offered a position as a co-anchor for the local evening news at Nashville's WTVF-TV, becoming the youngest person and the first African-American woman to hold such a position at the station. The television studio, with its bright lights and technical complexity, represented a new world to navigate. But Oprah approached it with the same adaptability that had helped her move between so many different environments throughout her childhood. These early professional experiences were not without their challenges. The broadcasting world of the early 1970s remained predominantly white and male, and Oprah encountered both subtle and overt forms of discrimination. Yet she persisted, developing the resilience that would become one of her defining characteristics. Each difficulty became not an insurmountable obstacle, but a lesson, something to be absorbed and transformed into wisdom. Throughout these formative years, Oprah maintained a connection to her spiritual roots, finding in faith a source of strength and perspective that helped her navigate the increasingly complex path she was walking. The lessons learned in those early days at her grandmother's rural church continued to resonate, providing an ethical framework and a sense of purpose that transcended material success. In 1976, Oprah moved to Baltimore to co-anchor the 6 o'clock news at WJZ-TV. The larger market brought new pressures and expectations, and not all of her early experiences there were positive. After a period of struggling in the traditional news format, station managers made a decision that would prove pivotal in Oprah's career trajectory. They reassigned her to a morning talk show called People Are Talking, a format that allowed her natural empathy and conversational gifts to shine in a way that the more rigid structure of news delivery had not. It was in this role, as a talk show host, that Oprah began to discover her true calling. The ability to connect with guests and audience members, to create a space where authentic conversation could unfold, revealed itself as her singular talent. Viewers responded to her warmth, her willingness to be vulnerable, her capacity to listen with genuine interest to the stories of others. These qualities, which might have seemed liabilities in the more detached world of traditional news reporting, became the foundation of her appeal in the more intimate format of the talk show. In 1984, Oprah accepted an offer to host AM Chicago, a morning talk show in a market far larger than Baltimore. Within months, her natural charisma and authentic approach had transformed the program from one struggling in the ratings to a local phenomenon. The show was renamed The Oprah Winfrey Show in 1985, and by the following year, it had gone into national syndication, beginning the remarkable journey that would make Oprah a household name across America and eventually around the world. This trajectory from rural poverty to national prominence unfolded against the backdrop of an America still working through the legacy of its racial history, still determining what equality would mean in practice rather than just in principle. Oprah's rise was not merely a personal triumph, but a cultural milestone. Her success challenging long-established limitations and expectations. The little girl who had once used corncobs as dolls on her grandmother's farm had traveled a long and winding road to become one of the most influential media figures of her generation. Yet in fundamental ways, the qualities that defined her public persona, warmth, empathy, intellectual curiosity, spiritual groundedness, were the same qualities that had been nurtured in those early years under Hattie Mee's care, in the church community of Kosciuszko, in the structured environment of her father's Nashville home. Oprah's story reminds us that our beginnings shape, but do not determine us, that adversity can become a source of strength rather than limitation, that the human capacity for growth and transformation remains one of life's most profound mysteries. As we drift toward sleep, we might carry with us the gentle reminder that within each life, even the most ordinary, lies the potential for extraordinary journeys, for connections that transcend circumstance, for growth that continues through all the seasons of our existence, like plants turning always toward the light. Let us drift further into the story as we explore the next part of this fascinating journey. In the gentle evening light that falls across the Mississippi Delta, the story of Oprah Winfrey begins, flowing like the great river itself through generations of struggle, perseverance, and quiet dignity. her ancestral roots reach deep into the rich soil of the American South, a tapestry of resilience woven through the complex history of a nation. Oprah Winfrey was born on January 29, 1954, in the rural community of Kosciuszko, Mississippi, the town itself, named after a Polish-Lithuanian military engineer who fought in the American Revolutionary War, sits nestled among rolling hills and tall pines, a place where time seems to move with the unhurried pace of southern summers. It was here, in this small corner of Atala County, that the first chapters of Oprah's family story unfolded. Her mother, Vernita Lee, was born in 1935 and grew up under the wide Mississippi sky. A young woman whose own dreams would be deferred as she navigated the challenges of early motherhood. Vernita was just 18 when Oprah was born. The name Oprah itself carries a story, originally intended to be Orpah, from the book of Ruth in the Bible. The spelling was changed when people consistently mispronounced it. A small adaptation that would become iconic in later years. Oprah's father, Vernon Winfrey, came from the neighboring state of Tennessee. Born into the segregated South, Vernon would later become a barber, a coal miner, and eventually a city councilman in Nashville. A man who valued education, discipline, and self-improvement, though not present in Oprah's earliest years. His influence would later shape significant periods of her life. The gentle roots of Oprah's family tree extend back to ancestors who lived through the profound transitions of American history. Through careful genealogical research, Oprah discovered that her ancestral lineage traced to the Capel people of Liberia, connecting her to the western shores of Africa, where cultural traditions of storytelling, community wisdom, and spiritual connection flourished for centuries before being disrupted by the transatlantic slave trade. In the soft hush of evening, we might imagine those ancestors gathering around fires, sharing tales that would be carried across oceans and generations, storytelling gifts that would one day find expression in a descendant who would captivate millions with her ability to draw out and honor others' stories. During the time of slavery, Oprah's maternal great-great-grandmother, a woman named Violet, lived on the Letitia Tyler plantation in Virginia. Family stories passed down speak of Violet's quiet strength, her ability to maintain dignity in circumstances designed to strip it away. She would whisper stories to her children at night, creating moments of tenderness and connection, even within the harsh confines of their reality. After emancipation, Oprah's ancestors, like many formerly enslaved people, moved throughout the South seeking opportunity and safety, carrying with them cultural traditions, spiritual practices, and survival knowledge. They brought recipes for foods that would comfort generations. Slow-cooked greens seasoned with smoked meat, cornbread baked in cast iron, sweet potato pie with warming spices that filled homes with inviting aromas. Perhaps the most profound influence on young Oprah's early life was her grandmother, Hattie Me Lee. In the simple farmhouse where they lived, Hattie Me created a world of structure and care for her granddaughter. The days began before sunrise, when Hattie Me would wake to stoke the wood stove, the gentle crackling of kindling a comforting sound in the pre-dawn darkness. Hattie Me had grown up in an era when formal education for black children in the rural South was limited, but she carried a deep respect for learning. She taught Oprah to read before the age of 3, using the Bible as their primary text. In the warm afternoons, they would sit on the porch swing, its gentle creaking keeping rhythm as Oprah practiced forming letters and sounding out words. The farmhouse had no running water or electricity, a reality that shaped daily rituals. Water was drawn from a well, heated on the stove for Saturday night baths in a metal tub placed in the middle of the kitchen floor. These were not hardships to young Oprah, but simply the texture of life, the way things were done. Hattie Me infused these routines with dignity and purpose, teaching her granddaughter that circumstances need not define one's sense of self-worth. Their days followed the natural rhythms of rural life, rising with the sun, tending to chickens whose soft clucking provided a backdrop to morning chores, gathering eggs from still warm nests. Hattie Me kept a garden where she grew much of their food, teaching Oprah to recognize when vegetables were ready for harvesting, how to gently pull carrots from the earth or snap peas from their vines. Sunday mornings meant church at Buffalo United Methodist, where the congregation gathered in their finest clothes. The church stood as the center of community life, not just a place of worship, but a gathering space where news was shared, relationships nurtured, and collective identity affirmed. Here, Oprah absorbed the cadences of preachers, the harmonies of gospel music, the call and response patterns that would later influence her communication style. The church provided Oprah with early performance opportunities. By age 3, she was reciting poems and Bible verses for the congregation, who called her the preacher for her remarkable ability to speak with conviction and emotion. These moments on the church podium planted seeds for a future where connecting with audiences would become her gift to the world. Family gatherings brought together extended relatives, creating a tapestry of relationships that extended beyond immediate family. Cousins, aunts, and uncles would visit, bringing dishes to share: sweet potato pies, fried chicken, collard greens, foods that carried cultural memory and connection. As they ate, stories would flow, tales of family history, humorous anecdotes, and lessons disguised as entertainment. When Oprah was 6, she moved to Milwaukee to live with her mother, Vernita, who had gone north like many Southern Black Americans, seeking better economic opportunities. This great migration, as historians would call it, represented one of the largest population shifts in American history, as millions of African Americans left the rural South for urban centers in the North and West. Between 1916 and 1970, the transition from rural Mississippi to urban Milwaukee brought cultural shock. Gone were the open spaces, the natural rhythms of farm life, the tight-knit community where everyone knew one another. Instead, Oprah encountered crowded apartments, street noise, and the anonymous nature of city living. The foods, accents, and social customs differed, requiring adaptation and resilience. These early years with her mother proved challenging. Vernita worked long hours as a maid, leaving little time for parenting. The household expanded to include a half-sister, Patricia, born when Oprah was 9. Resources were stretched thin, and stability was elusive. Family stories suggest this period held difficulties that Oprah would later transform into understanding and compassion for others facing similar circumstances. At age 12, Oprah was sent to live with her father, Vernon, in Nashville, Tennessee. This move marked another cultural transition, from the urban North back to the South, though to a different Southern experience than her early years in Mississippi. Vernon and his wife, Zelma, provided structure, emphasizing education, discipline, and self-improvement. Vernon's household operated with clear expectations. Chores were to be completed promptly, homework was prioritized, and reading was encouraged. Each week, Oprah was required to learn 5 new vocabulary words, expanding her command of language. Vernon would check her schoolwork regularly, expecting excellence and effort. Though strict, he provided the stability and guidance Oprah needed during her adolescent years. The Winfrey home in Nashville became a place where Oprah could put down roots after years of transition. Here, family traditions included Sunday dinners after church, where conversations ranged from current events to personal goals. Vernon, who would later serve on the Nashville City Council, encouraged awareness of civic responsibilities and community engagement. Nashville's vibrant Black community offered cultural richness. The city had historically significant Black educational institutions, including Fisk University and Tennessee State University, where Oprah would later study. These institutions had nurtured intellectual and artistic achievement for generations, creating an environment that valued knowledge and cultural expression. Throughout these transitions, certain family traditions remained constants in Oprah's life. Storytelling continued to bind generations, with family gatherings featuring tales of ancestors, community history, and personal experiences. Food traditions carried cultural memory, recipes passed down, cooking techniques demonstrated rather than written. The sensory experience of familiar dishes, creating continuity across different homes and circumstances. Spiritual practices provided another thread of continuity. Whether in her grandmother's Methodist church in Mississippi, congregations in Milwaukee, or Nashville's faith communities, the rhythms of worship, the language of scripture, and the comfort of shared belief created familiar ground amid change. These spiritual foundations would later influence Oprah's approach to her work and her understanding of purpose. As Oprah moved through adolescence in Nashville, she began to consciously connect with her cultural heritage. She participated in speech competitions, often choosing to recite works by Black authors and poets. She absorbed the teachings of the civil rights movement, which had significant moments in Nashville with its lunch counter sit-ins and community organizing. These influences helped shape her understanding of history, justice, and possibility. Family stories suggest that during this time, Oprah began asking more questions about her ancestry. Where exactly had her people come from? What were their names, their stories, their talents and dreams? Some answers came from elderly relatives who remembered grandparents who had been born into slavery. Other questions remained unanswered, lost to the disruptions of history, the unrecorded lives of those deemed unimportant by the record keepers of their time. This curiosity about roots, about the stories that shaped her family's journey, would later find expression in Oprah's professional life. Her interest in genealogy, her production of films exploring African American history, her book club selections that often dealt with themes of identity and heritage, the values instilled by her grandmother Hattie Mee, her father Vernon, and the various communities that nurtured her, created a foundation upon which Oprah would build her remarkable life. From Hattie Mee came spiritual groundedness, the dignity of work well done, and the power of literacy. From Vernon came discipline, high expectations, and civic awareness. From the broader communities of her childhood came cultural pride, resilience, and the art of connection. As we rest in the gentle flow of this family narrative, we might notice how these influences converged to shape not just a media personality, but a cultural force whose impact would extend far beyond entertainment. The child who practiced reading on a Mississippi porch, who recited Bible verses in a country church, who absorbed family stories at gatherings large and small, would one day create spaces where millions would experience the power of story, the healing potential of truth-telling, the possibility of growth and transformation. The journey from rural Mississippi to global influence unfolded gradually, with each step building upon the foundations laid by those who came before, ancestors whose names might be lost to history, but whose legacy lived on in values transmitted, in traditions maintained, in the quiet dignity with which they faced both hardship and joy. As sleep draws nearer, we might reflect on how our own family stories shape us, how the voices of those who came before continue to whisper guidance, how traditions create continuity amid life's inevitable changes. In the gentle darkness, we can imagine Oprah as a small child on her grandmother's farm, looking up at the vast Mississippi sky filled with stars, perhaps feeling even then the pull of possibility, the connection to something larger than herself, the beginning of a path that would wind through difficulty and triumph, always guided by the light of those who had shown the way. The peaceful narrative of this life continues as we turn our attention to what happened next. In the gentle warmth of rural Mississippi, little opera Gail Winfrey took her first breaths in a world that moved to rhythms as old as the land itself. Born on January 29, 1954, in the small, tucked-away town of Kosciuszko, Opera entered a landscape where cotton fields stretched toward distant horizons, and where time seemed to flow as unhurriedly as the nearby Pearl River. The Mississippi of Opera's earliest years was a place of profound contradictions, a land of natural beauty and human struggle, of tight-knit communities and painful divisions, of poverty and resourcefulness, intertwined in the daily fabric of life. The physical environment that cradled young Opera was one of rural simplicity. Her grandmother Hattie Mee Lee's farmhouse stood as a humble sanctuary amid the rolling countryside. It was a modest home, weathered by seasons and years, its wooden boards bearing silent witness to generations of family stories. The front porch, extending across the face of the house like an outstretched arm, served as the boundary between the private world of family and the community beyond. Here, in the cool of evening, after the punishing heat of Mississippi's summer days had begun to relent, neighbors might stop to exchange news and share the small events that made up the rhythm of rural life. Inside the farmhouse, spaces were functional rather than fancy. The kitchen, with its wood-burning stove, filled the home with warmth and aromas that would forever imprint themselves on Opera's sensory memory. The yeasty comfort of baking bread, the rich fragrance of collard greens simmering with ham hock, the sweet promise of peach cobbler cooling on the windowsill, light filtered through simple curtains, creating patterns that shifted across the wooden floors as the sun made its daily journey across the sky. The sounds of this childhood landscape created a constant, soothing backdrop to daily life. Roosters announced each dawn with persistent crowing, their calls echoing across the fields and gently pulling sleepers from their dreams. Throughout the day, the buzzing of cicadas rose and fell like natural breath, intense in the height of afternoon heat, then gradually subsiding as evening approached. Wind rustled through tall grasses and cornstalks, creating a whispering conversation that never quite ceased. At night, a symphony of crickets and frogs filled the darkness, their rhythmic chorus a lullaby that eased the transition from wakefulness to sleep. Water played its part in this sensory landscape too. Rain on the tin roof created a meditative drumming that could transform the inside of the house into a cocoon of comfort, while outside, puddles formed in the rutted dirt roads, reflecting sky and clouds in their temporary mirrors. In the distance, the Pearl River moved at its own unhurried pace, a constant presence that connected the community to a wider world beyond. The natural world around the farmhouse offered both sustenance and wonder. The garden that Hattie Mee tended with practiced hands provided much of the family's food, tomatoes warming in the sun, until their skins nearly burst with ripeness, beans climbing wooden stakes, sweet potatoes hiding their treasure beneath the soil. Young Oprah learned early the connection between land and table, watching as her grandmother transformed the earth's offerings into meals that nourished body and spirit alike. Beyond the immediate surroundings of home-stretched fields, where crops grew in orderly rows, their progression from seed to harvest, marking the passage of seasons more reliably than any calendar. Cotton dominated the agricultural landscape, its white bolls appearing like snow against the deep green plants in late summer. The cultivation and harvesting of cotton shaped not just the physical environment, but the social one as well, creating patterns of work and interaction that had evolved over generations. The social environment of Oprah's early childhood was centered around three primary spheres: family, church, and the wider African American community, each operating within the constraints of a segregated South. Family extended beyond the boundaries of the immediate household, creating a network of support and belonging that helped buffer against the harsher realities of the outside world. At the heart of this family system stood Hattie Mee, Oprah's grandmother, a woman whose presence filled their modest home with strength and purpose. Under her watchful guidance, young Oprah absorbed the unwritten rules and expectations that governed their daily existence. Hattie Mee's parenting style reflected the era and circumstances, firm, practical, and deeply rooted in spiritual faith. There was little indulgence for childhood whims in a household where resources were limited and work was ever present. Days began early in this rural setting, often before the first light of dawn softened the night sky. The routines of farm life dictated a schedule that followed the natural rhythms of daylight and seasons rather than clock time. Chores came first: feeding chickens, gathering eggs, bringing in water, helping with meal preparation, all tasks that connected household members to the immediate needs of survival and comfort. For young Oprah, these early years on her grandmother's farm, despite their material simplicity, provided a foundation of stability and clear expectations. She learned to read early, a skill encouraged by Hattie Mee, who recognized something special in her granddaughter's quick mind and expressive nature. Bible stories and verses became Oprah's first literature. Their rhythmic language and moral lessons forming the earliest layers of her understanding of the world and its possibilities. Church formed the second vital sphere of social influence, serving as both spiritual center and community gathering place. The small country church where Hattie Mee took Oprah stood as a sanctuary of hope and affirmation in a world that offered few such spaces to African Americans in 1950s Mississippi. Inside its walls, the community found not just religious instruction, but a place where dignity was affirmed and leadership was possible. Sunday mornings transformed the landscape as families dressed in their finest clothes made their way along dusty roads to worship services. The church building itself might have been humble, but it contained a wealth of sensory experiences that would remain with Oprah throughout her life. Wooden pews, polished by generations of Sunday best clothing, creaked gently as congregants settled themselves. Handheld fans, often bearing the printed face of Jesus, or advertisements from local funeral homes, moved back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm, stirring the heavy summer air. The sounds of church created their own distinctive atmosphere, the harmonies of gospel hymns rising and falling like waves, the cadence of preachers building from conversational tones to impassioned crescendos, the responsive amens and hallelujahs that punctuated sermons like heartbeats for a child with Oprah's verbal gifts. This environment provided rich material, and she soon became known for her ability to recite Bible verses with a dramatic flair that captivated listeners beyond family and church. The wider African American community of Kosciuszko created the third circle of Oprah's early social world. This was a community bound together by shared history, mutual support, and the complex web of relationships that developed in places where everyone knew not just your name, but your grandparents' names, your talents and shortcomings, your place in the intricate social geography of rural life. Neighbors looked out for one another's children, shared resources when times were lean, celebrated achievements, and comforted sorrows. Front porches served as gathering places where news traveled from house to house, where children played under watchful eyes, where stories were passed down that connected present difficulties to past resilience. This oral tradition, rich with humor, wisdom, and historical memory, provided a cultural education that no formal schooling could match. Yet, surrounding these concentric circles of support was the larger reality of segregated Mississippi, a place where the warm embrace of community existed alongside the cold restrictions of a society divided by race. The physical landscape itself reflected these divisions: separate neighborhoods, separate schools, separate sections in public spaces on the rare occasions when they were shared at all. For a sensitive child like Oprah, these boundaries were absorbed gradually, becoming part of her understanding of how the world worked before she had words to question or challenge them. The dirt roads that led from her grandmother's farm to town passed through a geography marked not just by natural features, but by invisible lines of permission and prohibition, of belonging and exclusion. When Oprah was around 6 years old, the physical landscape of her life shifted dramatically as she moved north to Milwaukee to join her mother, Vernita Lee. The transition from rural Mississippi to urban Wisconsin represented more than just a geographical change. It was an entry into a different sensory world, a different rhythm of daily life, a different set of social expectations and possibilities. The Milwaukee of the early 1960s where opera arrived, was a city of stark contrasts. Industrial might alongside economic struggles, neighborhoods defined by ethnic and racial boundaries, opportunities and limitations existing side by side for African American families like Oprah's. The northern city offered an escape from the formal segregation of the South, but presented its own forms of division and challenge. The physical space that now contained Oprah's daily life was an apartment in Milwaukee's inner city, a setting that could not have been more different from the open farmland of Mississippi. Instead of the expansive sky and distant horizons that had framed her earliest years, urban buildings now defined the boundaries of her visual world. The natural sounds of rural life, roosters, cicadas, wind in the fields, were replaced by the constant hum of city noise, traffic, neighbors' voices through thin walls, music from open windows, the mechanical rhythms of urban existence. The apartment itself was cramped and often crowded, with Oprah sharing space with her mother and half-sister Patricia. Vernita Lee worked long hours as a maid, struggling to support her family, which meant that Oprah often found herself responsible for household tasks, and her younger sisters care at an age when most children are primarily concerned with play and school. The sensory experience of this urban childhood had its own distinctive qualities. The smells of city life, automobile exhaust, industrial emissions, the cooking odors from multiple apartments sharing common walls, the distinctive scent of laundromats and corner stores created an olfactory landscape far removed from the natural fragrances of rural Mississippi. The textures underfoot changed from soft earth and grass to concrete sidewalks and asphalt streets, from the wooden floors of her grandmother's house to the linoleum tiles common in urban apartments of the era. The social environment shifted dramatically as well. The tight-knit community of rural Kosciuszko, where everyone knew everyone else and multiple generations lived in close proximity, gave way to the more anonymous interactions of city life. Neighbors might live for years, sharing common walls, without developing the deep connections that characterized rural relationships. The watchful eyes of extended family and longtime community members were no longer present to provide the protective oversight that had been a constant in Mississippi. For Oprah, this period represented a time of significant adjustment and often loneliness. The structured routine of farm life with her grandmother, despite its material simplicity, had provided a sense of security and predictability that was now absent. Her mother, though doing her best under difficult circumstances, was frequently absent due to work demands, leaving Oprah to navigate much of daily life on her own. School became increasingly important during these years, not just as a place of learning, but as a source of stability and recognition. In the classroom, Oprah's verbal abilities and quick intelligence found appreciation and encouragement. Teachers noticed her gift for public speaking her expressive reading, her ability to connect with others through words. These affirmations provided crucial support during a time when home life offered few such reassurances. The neighborhood streets and playgrounds became another significant environment, places where children created their own social structures and rules. Here, Oprah learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of urban childhood, forming alliances, avoiding conflicts, discovering her own strengths and vulnerabilities in relation to peers. The lessons learned in these informal settings would later inform her remarkable ability to connect with people from all walks of life, to read social situations with intuitive accuracy, to find common ground across differences of experience and background. As we drift toward sleep, we might imagine young Oprah moving between these contrasting worlds, the rural simplicity of her grandmother's farm and the urban complexity of her mother's apartment, absorbing lessons from each, developing the adaptability and perceptiveness that would later serve her so well. We can picture her sitting on the porch in Mississippi, listening to the stories of elders as twilight softened the landscape, or walking home from school through Milwaukee streets, observing the human drama unfolding around her with the keen attention that would one day make her one of our culture's most empathetic listeners. The physical and social environments of Oprah's childhood, with all their limitations and possibilities, became not just the background, but the soil from which her remarkable life would grow. The girl who learned to read by reciting Bible verses in a country church, who helped her grandmother hang laundry on outdoor lines to dry in the Mississippi sun, who navigated the challenges of urban poverty with resourcefulness and determination, was gathering experiences that would one day enable her to speak with authentic understanding to millions. As our consciousness begins to soften at the edges, giving way to the gentle approach of sleep, we might reflect on how the places that shape our earliest years continue to live within us, how the voices we hear in childhood echo through the corridors of our adult lives, how the challenges we face become, in ways we may never fully understand, the very foundations of our strength. In this drowsy contemplation, we can appreciate how the particular landscapes of Oprah Winfrey's childhood, both the physical spaces and the human relationships that filled them, contributed to creating not just a media personality, but a woman whose unique voice would eventually reach around the world, carrying with it always the authentic resonance of where she began. As you relax deeper, let us now softly explore the next chapter of this soothing biography. The educational journey of Oprah Winfrey unfolds like a gentle river, flowing through various landscapes of learning, each bend and current shaping the remarkable woman she would become. In those formative years, young Oprah's mind was like rich soil, ready to receive the seeds of knowledge that would later bloom into wisdom shared with millions around the world. Let us drift back to her early school days, when little Oprah first entered a classroom in rural Mississippi. Her grandmother Hattie Mee, who had taught her letters and numbers even before school began, had instilled in her a reverence for education. Oprah would often recall how her grandmother would say, in her soft, melodious voice, that education was the path to a better life, the key that could unlock doors previously closed to a young black girl from the South. These words settled into Oprah's consciousness like evening dew on morning grass, quiet but profoundly nourishing. At Lincoln Elementary School in Milwaukee, after moving from Mississippi to live with her mother, Oprah's exceptional abilities began to emerge like the first rays of dawn breaking through night's darkness. Her teachers noticed how she absorbed information with unusual eagerness, how she would lose herself in books during quiet moments, how words seemed to dance for her in ways they didn't for other children. One teacher in particular, Mrs. Duncan, recognized something special in the thoughtful girl with bright eyes and an expressive voice. She took extra time after school to provide Oprah with additional reading materials, gently guiding her toward literary worlds beyond the standard curriculum. Picture Oprah at 9 years old, sitting by a window in the school library, sunlight streaming across the pages of a book, her finger tracing the lines of poetry or prose, her mind expanding with each new idea encountered. In these quiet moments of communion with authors from different times and places, something profound was happening. A young girl was discovering that through words, she could travel beyond the limitations of her circumstances, could touch the universal experiences that connect all human hearts. By the time she was in elementary school, Oprah had developed a reputation as the reading machine, a nickname that floated around her like a soft cloud of recognition. She would often be asked to read aloud in class, her voice already carrying that distinctive warmth and clarity that would later become familiar to millions. Her classmates would settle into a gentle attentiveness when she read, drawn by her natural ability to infuse words with meaning and emotion. When Oprah moved to Nashville to live with her father Vernon, her educational journey entered a new chapter, like a stream joining a wider river. Vernon Winfrey was strict about education, establishing firm routines for homework and reading. Under his watchful but loving guidance, Oprah's academic performance blossomed further. The structure he provided was like a trellis supporting a growing vine, allowing her natural talents to reach toward the light. At East Nashville High School, Oprah continued to excel academically while discovering new dimensions of her abilities. It was here that she first experienced the power of public speaking, joining the debate team and finding that her voice could move people, could make them think and feel. Her speech teacher, Mrs. Marion Tasco, recognized her extraordinary talent and spent many afternoons helping Oprah refine her delivery, teaching her about pacing and emphasis, about the music that lives within language when it's spoken with intention. Imagine Oprah standing in an empty classroom after school hours, practicing a speech while Mrs. Tasco listened attentively, offering gentle suggestions about where to pause, how to modulate her voice, how to connect with an audience through authenticity rather than artifice. These quiet lessons in the art of communication would prove invaluable in years to come, laying the foundation for her future career in broadcasting. During these high school years, Oprah also discovered the works of Maya Angelou, whose poetry and prose spoke to her with particular resonance. Reading I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings was a transformative experience, like finding a mirror that reflected back not just her own experiences, but the deeper truths of human resilience and dignity. Angelou's words settled into Oprah's consciousness like gentle rain into thirsty ground, nourishing her developing sense of self and possibility. At 16, Oprah's academic achievements and natural charisma led to an opportunity that would change the course of her life. She won a speaking competition sponsored by the Elks Club, earning a full scholarship to Tennessee State University, a historically Black institution with a proud legacy of education and advancement. This achievement was like a door opening onto a wider landscape of possibility, an affirmation of her intellectual gifts, and a pathway to higher learning. Let us visualize young Oprah walking across the Tennessee State University campus for the first time, autumn leaves drifting down around her, the red brick buildings standing solid and dignified against the blue southern sky. Here, among fellow students who shared her ambition and professors who challenged her thinking, Oprah's intellectual world expanded further, like a horizon growing more distant as one climbs higher. At Tennessee State, Oprah majored in speech communications and performing arts, fields that aligned perfectly with her natural talents. Professor Dorothy Gilliam became an important mentor, recognizing in Oprah not just academic ability, but a rare quality of presence and authenticity. Professor Gilliam would invite Oprah to her office for discussions that went beyond coursework, conversations about literature, about the civil rights movement, about the responsibilities that come with the gift of communication. These conversations would often extend into the early evening, the office growing dimmer as daylight faded, neither participant noticing the changing light. So engaged were they in the exchange of ideas. Professor Gilliam would later recall how Oprah seemed to absorb knowledge not just with her mind, but with her entire being. How she would listen with such intensity that it felt like a physical force. How she would respond with insights that revealed a wisdom beyond her years. During her sophomore year at Tennessee State, Oprah began working part-time at WVOL, a local radio station serving Nashville's Black community. Here, in a small studio with equipment that had seen better days, she first experienced the intimate connection between broadcaster and audience, the special alchemy that happens when a human voice travels through the airwaves to reach listeners in their homes, their cars, their private spaces. The station manager John Heidelberg, noticed Oprah's exceptional voice quality and her natural ability to connect with listeners. He gradually gave her more responsibilities, moving her from weekend shifts to more prominent time slots. Under his guidance, she learned the technical aspects of broadcasting, how to operate the equipment, how to time segments, how to create a flow that would keep listeners engaged. More importantly, she began to develop her distinctive approach to communication, one based on authenticity and emotional honesty rather than polished performance. Imagine Oprah in that small radio booth, headphones covering her ears, microphone positioned perfectly, her voice flowing out into the night, reaching people she would never see, but with whom she was forming a relationship of trust and mutual recognition. In these quiet hours of connection through sound alone, she was discovering her calling, like someone who has been walking in darkness, suddenly finding the right path beneath their feet. While still a sophomore, Oprah's exceptional speaking abilities and growing reputation as a radio personality led to another pivotal opportunity. She was invited to compete in the Miss Black Tennessee pageant, an event that celebrated not just physical beauty, but intelligence, talent, and poise. Oprah approached this challenge with characteristic thoroughness, preparing a dramatic reading from Richard Wright's Black Boy that showcased both her interpretive skills and her deep connection to African American literary traditions. The night of the pageant, as she stood on stage in a simple but elegant gown, Oprah delivered her reading with such emotional truth and technical mastery that the audience fell into a reverent silence, followed by enthusiastic applause. She won the competition, another affirmation of her exceptional abilities, and another step on her journey toward broader recognition. This victory brought with it an unexpected opportunity. A local CBS television affiliate, WTVF-TV, impressed by her performance in the pageant, offered her a position as a news anchor, making her the first Black female news anchor in Nashville's history. This development meant balancing her studies with professional responsibilities, a challenge that Oprah met with determination and energy, though it sometimes meant studying late into the night after finishing her shift at the station. At WTVF, Oprah encountered both opportunities and obstacles. Some viewers and colleagues were not ready to accept a young Black woman in such a visible position. There were letters of complaint, some questioning her qualifications, others expressing more explicitly racist views. Yet, there were also viewers who wrote to express their appreciation, who saw in Oprah's presence on screen a sign of progress, a reason for hope. Her news director, Chris Clark, became another important mentor, teaching her about journalistic ethics, about the responsibility that comes with entering people's homes through the medium of television, about the importance of accuracy and fairness in reporting. He also encouraged her to develop her own style, rather than trying to conform to conventional notions. of how a news anchor should look and sound as we drift deeper toward sleep. We might imagine Oprah in these formative years, moving between the academic world of Tennessee State and the professional environment of the television station, absorbing lessons from both, gradually discovering that her greatest strength lay not in delivering the news in a traditional manner, but in connecting with people on a deeper, more personal level. This realization came into sharper focus when she was assigned to co-host a morning talk show called People Are Talking, after moving to Baltimore to work at WJZ-TV. Here, in conversations with ordinary people about matters that affected their daily lives, Oprah found her true medium. The format allowed her to use all her gifts, her intelligence, her empathy, her ability to listen deeply, her talent for asking questions that opened up meaningful dialogue throughout this educational and early professional journey. Oprah was not just acquiring knowledge and skills. She was developing a philosophy, an approach to communication and human connection that would eventually make her one of the most influential cultural voices of her time. This philosophy was grounded in the belief that authentic human stories, shared with honesty and received with empathy, have the power to bridge differences, to heal wounds, to create community. As sleep begins to envelop us like a soft blanket, we might reflect on how Oprah's educational journey illustrates the power of learning that extends beyond formal institutions, that embraces life itself as the greatest teacher. From the Bible verses she memorized on her grandmother's porch to the sophisticated discussions in university classrooms, from the technical skills acquired in radio booths to the human insights gained through countless interviews. Oprah Winfrey's intellectual development has been a continuous process of growth, a gentle unfolding of potential that continues to this day. In this drowsy contemplation, we can appreciate how the particular quality of Oprah's intelligence, emotional as well as analytical, intuitive as well as logical, has allowed her to serve as a bridge between different worlds, different perspectives, different ways of understanding human experience. As we drift off to sleep, we carry with us the comforting thought that education, in its truest sense, is not just about acquiring information, but about developing the wisdom to use knowledge in service of deeper human connection. Our soothing biography continues with a look at the next important period in this incredible life. From the earliest days of her childhood, Oprah Winfrey was held by the steady hands of mentors and guides who saw something luminous within her, even when she could not yet see it herself. These relationships unfolded like slow, meandering rivers, sometimes quiet and steady, sometimes rushing with intensity, but always carrying her toward a deeper understanding of herself and the world. One of the first and most profound influences was her grandmother, Hattie Mee Lee, who raised her during those early, formative years in rural Mississippi. Hattie Mee was a woman of deep faith and quiet strength, who taught Oprah the power of words before she could even read them. On the porch of their small home, with the warm southern air humming around them, her grandmother would recite Bible verses, her voice a gentle rhythm that imprinted on Oprah's young mind. There was something sacred in those moments, not just in the words themselves, but in the way they were spoken, with reverence, with certainty, with the unshakable belief that language could shape a life. Later, Oprah would say that those early lessons in storytelling, in the weight and music of words, became the foundation of her ability to communicate with millions. Then there was her father, Vernon Winfrey, who became a stabilizing force when Oprah moved to Nashville as a teenager. He was strict, but his discipline was rooted in love, a love that demanded she rise to her potential. He insisted on perfect diction, on the importance of education, on the discipline of hard work. Every week, he required her to read a book and write a report on it, a task that might have seemed tedious to another child, but which Oprah embraced with growing curiosity. It was under his roof that she discovered the power of structure, of setting high expectations for oneself. Years later, she would reflect on how that household, with its rules and its quiet encouragement, gave her the framework she needed to thrive. But mentors were not only found at home. In high school, there was Mrs. Duncan, the English teacher who recognized Oprah's gift for speaking and encouraged her to compete in oratory contests. It was Mrs. Duncan who first planted the idea that her voice could take her places, that words could be more than just sounds, but instruments of change. And then, at Tennessee State University, there was Dr. Barbara King, a professor who introduced Oprah to philosophy, to the deeper questions about meaning and purpose. Dr. King didn't just teach, she engaged, she challenged. She made ideas come alive in a way that stayed with Oprah long after the lectures ended. Yet perhaps one of the most transformative relationships in Oprah's early career was with the radio broadcaster John Heidelberg, who gave her first professional job at WVOL in Nashville. He saw something raw but undeniable in her, an authenticity, an ease with the microphone that couldn't be taught. He didn't try to mold her into something she wasn't. Instead, he gave her the space to be herself, to trust her instincts. That lesson, that true influence comes from being fully who you are, would become a cornerstone of her philosophy in media. And then, of course, there was Maya Angelou, the poet and author whose wisdom would become a lifelong touchstone for Oprah. Their friendship was one of mutual admiration, of deep conversations that stretched late into the night, of letters and phone calls filled with guidance. Maya didn't just offer advice. She offered a way of seeing the world. She taught Oprah about grace under pressure, about the power of resilience, about the necessity of speaking one's truth, even when it was difficult. Their bond was so profound that Oprah often referred to her as mother-sister-friend, a relationship that transcended the usual boundaries of mentorship. Each of these figures, her grandmother, her father, her teachers, her early professional guides, left imprints on Oprah's spirit, shaping not just her career, but her very way of being in the world. They taught her that growth is not a solitary journey, but one woven through with the wisdom of others. And as sleep wraps around you now, you might imagine Oprah herself reflecting on these relationships, on the voices that whispered encouragement when she needed it most, on the hands that steadied her when the path was uncertain. And in that quiet reflection, there is a gentle truth that we are all shaped by those who believe in us before we believe in ourselves, that the most enduring lessons are not found in books alone, but in the quiet exchanges, the shared moments, the unspoken understandings between teacher and student, mentor and protege. So as you drift into sleep, let yourself rest in the comfort of that thought, that no one truly walks alone, and that the voices of those who guide us remain soft but steady long after their words have been spoken. Let your mind float with these gentle recollections as we move forward in our story. The journey of Oprah Winfrey's early career was not a straight path, but rather a series of steps, some small, some bold, each one leading her closer to the voice she was meant to share with the world. It began in the quiet hum of a radio station in Nashville, where, at just 17 years old, she landed her first job as a newsreader. The year was 1971, a time when the airwaves were still dominated by male voices, and opportunities for young black women in broadcasting were rare. But Oprah had a presence, a warmth that could not be ignored. Even then, her voice carried something deeper than just words. It carried feeling, a connection that made listeners lean in a little closer. She worked at WVOL, a small station that served the black community, reading the news after school. The studio was modest, with crackling microphones and the faint scent of warm electronics. But to Oprah, it was a palace of possibility. There, she learned the rhythm of storytelling, the weight of a well-placed pause, the power of speaking with conviction. Her co-workers noticed her natural ease on air, the way she could make even the driest news bulletin sound like a story worth hearing. It was here, in this unassuming place, that she first understood the magic of holding someone's attention through nothing but her voice. From radio, she stepped into television, a medium that would become her true home. At 19, she became the youngest and first black female news anchor at WTVF-TV, Nashville's CBS affiliate. The newsroom was fast-paced, filled with the clatter of typewriters and the urgent voices of reporters rushing to meet deadlines. Oprah was determined to prove herself, but the challenges were many. The industry was still adjusting to the idea of women, especially black women, delivering the news with authority. Some viewers wrote letters questioning her presence, and there were moments when she felt the weight of being the only one in the room who looked like her. But Oprah had a way of turning obstacles into opportunities. she found that the more she leaned into her own authenticity, the more people responded. She wasn't interested in stiff, formal delivery. She wanted to talk to people, not at them. This approach didn't always fit the traditional news format, but it was the beginning of something new, something that would later redefine television itself. Her big break came when she moved to Baltimore in 1976 to co-anchor the evening news at WJZ-TV. The city was vibrant, pulsing with energy, but the transition wasn't easy. The station's management wanted her to change to straighten her hair, to soften her features, to sound less like herself, and more like what they thought a news anchor should be. Oprah struggled under these expectations, feeling the strain of trying to fit into a mold that wasn't meant for her. It was a lonely time, one where she questioned whether she belonged in broadcasting at all. Then, something unexpected happened. She was pulled from the news desk and offered a spot on a morning talk show called People Are Talking. At first, she hesitated. Talk shows were seen as less prestigious than hard news, and she worried it might be a step backward. But when she sat across from her first guest, something clicked. The format allowed her to be herself, curious, empathetic, unafraid to laugh, or even cry if the moment called for it. The audience responded immediately. Ratings soared, and Oprah discovered her gift, the ability to make people feel seen, to turn interviews into conversations that mattered. Baltimore became her training ground, the place where she honed her craft. She interviewed everyone from politicians to everyday people with extraordinary stories, learning how to listen deeply, how to ask the right questions, how to create moments of genuine connection. The show's success caught the attention of a struggling station in Chicago, WLS-TV, which was looking for someone to revive their morning program. AM Chicago. In 1983, Oprah arrived in the Windy City, a place that would soon become synonymous with her name. When she walked into the studio on her first day, the energy was uncertain. The show was floundering in the ratings, and no one was sure if this young, relatively unknown host could turn things around. But Oprah had a quiet confidence, a sense that this was where she was meant to be. She didn't try to mimic the other talk show hosts of the time, the flashy, confrontational styles that dominated daytime TV. Instead, she leaned into her own way of being, open, honest, unafraid to show vulnerability. Within months, AM Chicago went from last place to the highest-rated talk show in the city. The station took notice, expanding her time slot and eventually renaming the show the Oprah Winfrey Show Asterisk. It was a turning point, not just for Oprah, but for television itself. Here was a woman who spoke with the depth of a friend, who tackled difficult topics with grace, who made viewers feel like they were part of the conversation. The historical context of her rise is important to remember. The 1980s were a time of great cultural shifts. The civil rights movement had paved the way. but representation in media was still limited. Oprah's success was groundbreaking, proving that a black woman could not only compete in daytime television, but redefine it. She brought discussions about race, gender, and personal growth into living rooms across America, often broaching subjects that others avoided. And through it all, she never lost the lessons of her early mentors, the value of authenticity, the importance of resilience, the power of listening. The people who had believed in her before she fully believed in herself had planted seeds that were now blooming in ways no one could have predicted. As you rest now, you might imagine Oprah in those early days, sitting behind a microphone or a news desk, finding her voice one word at a time. It's a comforting thought, isn't it, that even the most iconic journeys begin with small steps, with moments of doubt, with the quiet courage to keep going. And just as Oprah carried the wisdom of those who guided her, you too can rest knowing that the voices of encouragement, whether from the past or the present, are always there, gently reminding you that the path unfolds one soft, steady step at a time. Drifting like clouds across the evening sky, we now move to the next part of this calming life story. Oprah Winfrey's journey was one of quiet revolutions, each step forward marked not by grand declarations, but by deep, intentional work, listening, learning, and lifting others as she rose. By the mid-1980s, her daytime talk show, The Oprah Winfrey Show *, had already begun to shift the landscape of television. But it was in the years that followed that her influence truly blossomed, touching lives in ways that transcended entertainment. She didn't just host a show. She created a space where people felt seen, where their stories mattered, where healing could begin. Her method was simple, yet profound. She approached every conversation with an open heart, leaning in, making eye contact, listening not just to respond, but to understand. There was a warmth in her presence, a safety that allowed guests, whether celebrities or everyday people, to share their deepest struggles and triumphs. She had a way of asking just the right question, gently peeling back layers until the truth emerged. And when someone cried, she often did too, because she never held herself apart from the emotion of the moment. That authenticity was her signature, and it made her show feel like a conversation with a trusted friend. One of her most defining contributions was her willingness to tackle topics that others avoided. In an era when personal struggles were often kept private, she brought discussions of abuse, addiction, and mental health into the open. She shared her own experiences with childhood trauma, creating a ripple effect that encouraged others to speak their truths. Survivors wrote to her by the thousands, thanking her for giving them the courage to seek help. It was as if her vulnerability gave them permission to be vulnerable too. And in that shared honesty, healing began. Then there was her book club, launched in 1996, which became a cultural phenomenon. With each selection, she didn't just recommend a book, she invited viewers into a deeper conversation about life, love, and human nature. The moment she held up a novel and said, "This is my next book club pick," it would soar to the top of bestseller lists, often selling millions of copies overnight. But more than boosting sales, she reignited a love of reading in people who had long set books aside. She showed that literature wasn't just for scholars or elites. It was for everyone, a way to explore the world and understand ourselves better. Her impact extended far beyond television. In 1998, she co-founded Oxygen Media, a network dedicated to programming for women, and later launched OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network, which became a platform for stories of transformation and empowerment. She produced films and documentaries that shed light on important issues, like Beloved Asterisk, an adaptation of Toni Morrison's novel, and The Color Purple Asterisk, which she also starred in early in her career. Each project was chosen with care, always with an eye toward lifting voices that had been marginalized. Perhaps one of her most enduring legacies is her philanthropy. She gave generously, but never for show. Her donations were thoughtful, aimed at creating lasting change. She built schools, funded scholarships, and supported countless charities, always with the belief that education was the surest path to empowerment. Her Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa, opened in 2007, was especially close to her heart. She designed it to provide not just academic excellence, but emotional support, knowing that young women needed both to thrive. The letters from her students, many of whom went on to become doctors, engineers, and leaders in their communities, were among her proudest achievements. And then there was O, the Opera Magazine Asterisk, a publication that felt like an extension of her show, full of wisdom, inspiration, and practical advice. Its pages were filled with interviews, essays, and reflections, all carrying her signature warmth. Even in print, her voice came through, steady and reassuring, as if she were sitting across from you with a cup of tea, sharing stories that mattered. Through all these endeavors, her guiding principle remained the same: connection. Whether through a TV screen, a book, or a charitable act, she sought to bridge gaps, to remind people of their shared humanity. She often spoke of living your best life, a phrase that became her mantra. But it was never about material success. It was about purpose, about using your gifts to make a difference. As you reflect on her journey now, you might picture her sitting in her studio, surrounded by an audience hanging on her every word, or walking through the halls of her school in South Africa, hugging a student who had just shared her dreams. Each moment was part of a larger tapestry, woven with threads of courage, compassion, and unwavering belief in the power of storytelling. And just as she found her way, step by step, so too can you rest easy tonight, knowing that every small act of kindness, every moment of listening, every leap of faith adds up to something beautiful. The world changes not in one sweeping motion, but in countless quiet ways, just as opera showed us one conversation, one book, one life at a time. So let your thoughts drift now, carried by the gentle rhythm of her story, and trust that the same possibilities that unfolded for her are unfolding for you, softly, steadily, in their own perfect time. As your breathing becomes more regular, let us continue with the next chapter of our biography. Imagine a young Oprah Winfrey, barely into her 20s, standing at the first major crossroads of her career. She had been working as a news anchor in Baltimore, a role that, by all outward measures, was a success. But something didn't quite fit. The stiff formality of the newsroom, the scripted detachment required of her, it all felt at odds with the way she naturally connected with people. Then came the offer to co-host a morning talk show. People are talking. It was a risk. Talk shows weren't seen as prestigious as news, and stepping away from a steady path might have seemed reckless. But Oprah listened to that quiet inner voice, the one that told her she was meant for something more fluid, more human. She took the leap, and in doing so, she found her true medium: conversation, storytelling, the kind of raw, unfiltered connection that would later define her legacy. Had she stayed in news, she might have been successful, even celebrated, but the world would have missed out on the Oprah, who could make an entire audience feel seen, the Oprah who could turn an interview into a moment of collective healing. It was here, in the unscripted spaces of talk television, that she began to understand the power of her own voice, not just to inform, but to transform. Years later, another pivotal moment arrived. She had been hosting AM Chicago *, a local talk show that quickly outpaced its competitors in ratings. Then, in 1986, the show was renamed the Oprah Winfrey Show *, and it went national almost overnight. She was no longer just a local personality. She was a national phenomenon. But with that fame came a choice. Would she follow the well-worn path of sensationalism, the kind of daytime TV that thrived on scandal and spectacle? Or would she shape the show into something deeper, something that reflected her own values? She chose the latter. She began tackling topics others avoided: sexual abuse, addiction, grief, with a rare honesty that made viewers feel less alone. What if she had taken the easier route, leaning into drama rather than depth? The show might still have been popular, but it wouldn't have become the cultural touchstone it did. It wouldn't have inspired millions to confront their own stories with courage. This decision, to prioritize meaning over ratings, set the tone for everything that followed: her book club, her philanthropy, her entire philosophy of using media as a force for good. Then there was the moment she decided to take ownership of her work in the most literal sense. In 1988, she founded Harpo Productions, making her one of the first women in entertainment to own her own studio. It was a bold move, one that required not just vision, but a willingness to take on financial and creative risk. But Oprah understood that true freedom, the kind that allows you to stay aligned with your purpose, comes from having control over your own narrative. Had she remained under the thumb of a network, she might have had to compromise in ways that dulled her message. Instead, she built a platform where her voice and the voices of others could ring out clear and true. One of the most defining turning points, though, came not in her career, but in her personal journey in the mid-1990s. After years of struggling with her weight and the public scrutiny that came with it, she made a decision that would shift her relationship with herself forever. She stopped dieting. She stopped punishing her body to fit someone else's expectations. Instead, she began to focus on health, on wholeness, on treating herself with the same kindness she so freely gave to others. It was a quiet revolution, one that resonated with women everywhere who had been taught to see their bodies as problems to be solved. What if she had continued chasing thinness, allowing the world to dictate her worth? She might have remained trapped in a cycle of shame, unable to fully step into the role of the empowered, self-accepting leader she became. Instead, her honesty about her struggles gave others permission to embrace their own imperfections, to recognize that living your best life isn't about perfection, it's about presence. And then, of course, there was the leap into acting. In 1985, she took on the role of Sophia in The Color Purple Asterisk, a performance that would earn her an Academy Award nomination. It was her first major foray into film, and it opened her eyes to the power of storytelling in yet another form. Acting allowed her to step into someone else's shoes, to amplify voices that had been marginalized. Later, she would produce films and television projects that did the same, like Beloved and Selma. Had she dismissed acting as a distraction from her talk show, she might never have discovered this new dimension of her creativity, one that further expanded her ability to connect with audiences on an emotional level. Perhaps the most profound turning point, however, was the decision to end the Oprah Winfrey show Asterisk in 2011 after 25 seasons. It was the show that had made her a household name, the foundation of her empire. Walking away could have felt like stepping into the unknown. But Oprah knew that growth requires release, that sometimes you have to let go of what's familiar to make space for what's next. And what came next was OWN, the Oprah Winfrey Network, a platform that allowed her to cultivate new voices and stories. It wasn't an immediate success. There were struggles, setbacks, but she stayed the course, trusting that the vision would unfold in its own time. Had she clung to the safety of her talk show, she might have avoided those early stumbles at OWN, but she also would have missed the chance to build something that could outlast her, something that could continue to inspire long after her final episode aired. Each of these moments, each risk, each reinvention was like a stitch in the tapestry of her life, weaving together a story of resilience and faith. And isn't that the way life works for all of us, we stand at crossroads, big and small, and the choices we make shape not just our own path, but the lives of those we touch. Oprah's story reminds us that there are no wrong turns, only lessons, that every decision, even the difficult ones, carries us closer to who we're meant to be. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, think of your own turning points, the moments that changed everything. Know that you too are being guided by something greater, something as steady and sure as the voice that whispered to Oprah all those years ago. And trust that the next chapter, whatever it may be, is unfolding exactly as it should, softly, gently, in its own perfect time. The calming story continues as we gently examine what happened next in this remarkable journey. From the very beginning, Oprah Winfrey's life was shaped by the people who loved her, challenged her, and believed in her potential. The bonds she formed, whether with family, friends, lovers, or colleagues, became the invisible threads that wove through the tapestry of her journey, each one leaving an imprint on her heart and her legacy. Her earliest and perhaps most complicated relationship was with her mother, Vernita Lee, born to a young, unmarried mother in rural Mississippi. Oprah spent her first years being passed between her grandmother, Hattie Mee, and her mother, who often struggled to provide stability. Yet, in those early years with Hattie Mee, Oprah found her first taste of unconditional love. Her grandmother taught her to read before the age of 3, nurturing the curiosity that would later make her one of the most influential voices in media. Even as she moved between homes, Oprah carried the warmth of her grandmother's faith, a quiet assurance that she was special. When she reunited with her mother in Milwaukee, life became more difficult. Vernita worked long hours as a maid, leaving Oprah often unsupervised in a neighborhood where danger lurked. The absence of consistent care left wounds that would take years to heal. Yet Oprah never stopped loving her mother. In time, she would financially support Vernita, even buying her a home, a gesture that spoke of forgiveness and the deep desire to transform pain into something better. Their relationship was never simple, but it taught Oprah about resilience, about how love could endure even through hardship. Then there was the father figure who changed everything, Vernon Winfrey. When Oprah was sent to live with him in Nashville as a teenager, she found the structure and discipline she had always needed. Vernon was strict, insisting on education, hard work, and responsibility. Under his watch, Oprah thrived. She became an honor student, won speech competitions, and earned a scholarship to Tennessee State University. He didn't just give her rules, he gave her the belief that she could achieve greatness. Years later, when she became a household name, she would credit him with saving her life. Their bond was one of quiet strength, a reminder that sometimes the people who love us most are the ones who refuse to let us settle for less than we deserve. Romantic relationships, too, shaped Oprah in profound ways. In her early 20s, she fell deeply in love with a man named William Bubba Taylor. Their relationship was passionate but tumultuous, marked by highs and lows that mirrored Oprah's own struggles with self-worth at the time when she became pregnant at 14. The baby died shortly after birth, a loss that haunted her for years. That experience, heartbreaking as it was, became part of her understanding of resilience, of how love and loss could exist side by side. Later, she would speak openly about the relationship, not with bitterness, but with the wisdom of someone who had learned from every chapter of her life. Then came Stedman Graham, the man who would stand by her side for decades. Unlike the fiery intensity of her earlier romance, Stedman offered something different: steadiness, respect, and unwavering support. They met in 1986 at a charity event, and though Oprah was already rising to fame, Stedman never seemed intimidated by her success. Instead, he encouraged it. He understood her ambition, her drive to keep growing, and he never asked her to dim her light for him. Their relationship wasn't without its challenges: the constant public scrutiny, the questions about why they never married. But through it all, they remained committed. Stedman became her rock, the quiet force who reminded her that love didn't have to be loud to be real. Friendship, too, played a vital role in Oprah's life. Few bonds were as enduring as the one she shared with Gayle King. They met in their early 20s, when Oprah was a young reporter in Baltimore, and Gayle was a production assistant. From the start, they clicked, laughing over inside jokes, staying up late to share dreams and fears, becoming the kind of friends who didn't need words to understand each other. Gayle was the sister Oprah never had, the one who could celebrate her victories without envy and comfort her in moments of doubt. Their friendship became legendary, a testament to the power of loyalty and unconditional love. Even as Oprah's fame skyrocketed, Gayle remained the person who knew her best, the one who could still make her laugh until her stomach hurt, just like they did when they were young and still figuring life out. Professionally, Oprah's collaborations were just as transformative. Her partnership with Quincy Jones led to her breakthrough role in The Color Purple Asterisk, a film that not only showcased her acting talent, but opened doors to a wider world of opportunity. Jones saw something in her that others hadn't yet recognized, and his belief in her helped her believe in herself. Years later, she would repay that faith by mentoring others, passing on the same encouragement she had received. Then there was Dr. Maya Angelou, the towering literary figure who became Oprah's spiritual mother. Their connection was instant and profound. Maya's wisdom, her ability to articulate the deepest truths of the human experience, resonated with Oprah in a way few things ever had. She became Oprah's guide, the voice that reminded her of her own strength. When Maya passed away in 2014, Oprah mourned not just a mentor, but a kindred spirit. Yet even in loss, Their bond endured through Maya's words, through the lessons she had imparted, through the love that never faded. And of course, there were the millions of viewers who became part of Oprah's extended family for 25 years. She invited them into her life, sharing stories that made them laugh, cry, and think. She didn't just host a show, she built a community. The people who watched her weren't just an audience, they were her partners in a conversation about what it means to live a meaningful life. When she launched her book club, she didn't just recommend novels, she sparked a global dialogue about literature, empathy, and the power of storytelling. Her relationship with her viewers was built on trust, a rare and beautiful thing in the world of media. Through all these connections, the love, the conflicts, the reconciliations, Oprah learned that relationships weren't just about what she received, but what she gave. She understood that the people who shaped her life were also shaped by her in return. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson of all, that we are all mirrors for one another, reflecting back the best, and sometimes the hardest truths. So as you drift into sleep tonight, think of the people who have left their mark on your own life. The ones who loved you, the ones who challenged you, the ones who saw your potential before you did. Like Oprah, you are part of a web of connections, each one a thread in the larger story. And just as she found meaning in every relationship, whether fleeting or lifelong, you too can rest in the knowledge that every bond, every moment of connection is part of the journey. Close your eyes now and let the warmth of those memories surround you. The people who matter are never truly gone. They live on in the lessons they taught, the love they shared, and the quiet ways they helped you become who you are. And just like Oprah, you are still becoming, still growing, still being shaped by the gentle hands of those who walk beside you. Sleep well, knowing that you too are held in the embrace of something greater, a love that endures, a connection that never fades. Allow yourself to sink deeper into comfort as we explore the next phase of this soothing biography. Oprah Winfrey's personal life, like the quiet hum of a summer evening, was filled with simple pleasures, deep connections, and moments of quiet reflection. Though the world knew her as a media titan, a philanthropist, and a cultural icon, those closest to her saw a woman who cherished the small, sacred rituals of everyday life. She believed that true happiness was found not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet spaces between the morning cup of tea, the rustle of pages turning in a beloved book, the laughter shared over a home-cooked meal. At the heart of her world was her home in Montecito, California, a place she often described as her sanctuary. The sprawling estate, with its lush gardens and serene pathways, was where she felt most at peace. She loved waking up early, before the sun had fully risen, to walk the grounds in silence, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. The scent of lavender and rosemary from her garden would float on the breeze, and she would pause to touch the leaves, grounding herself in the quiet beauty of nature. one of her most cherished routines was reading. Books were her lifelong companions, and she often spoke of how they had saved her, comforted her, and expanded her world. Her library was filled with well-worn volumes, their spines softened by years of gentle handling. She read voraciously, but never rushed. Each book was savored, each sentence given space to breathe. Some nights, she would stay up late, lost in a story, the soft glow of her reading lamp the only light in the room. It was in these quiet hours that she felt most connected to the writers who had shaped her, their words whispering across time to meet her where she was. Food, too, was a source of joy and comfort. She loved to cook, finding something meditative in the rhythm of chopping vegetables, stirring pots, and tasting as she went. One of her favorite dishes was a simple butternut squash soup, rich with spices and warmth. She believed that meals were meant to be shared, and some of her happiest memories were gathered around her table with friends, the conversation flowing as freely as the wine. Stedman Graham, her partner of many years, was often by her side during these moments, a steady, grounding presence. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and deep friendship, a love that didn't need grand declarations to feel real. They laughed together, traveled together, and sometimes just sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but content in the other's company. Travel was another of Oprah's great loves. She adored exploring new places, not for the sake of luxury, but for the way it opened her heart and mind. One of her most meaningful journeys was to South Africa, where she built a school for girls, pouring her energy into creating opportunities for young women who reminded her of her younger self. The connections she made there with the students, the teachers, the land itself stayed with her long after she returned home. She often spoke of how travel humbled her, how it reminded her that the world was so much bigger than any one person's story. Animals, too, held a special place in her heart. Her dogs, especially her beloved Cocker Spaniels, were constant companions, their unconditional love a balm on even the most challenging days. She would often be found sitting on her porch with a dog curled at her feet, their steady breathing a reminder of life's simple, uncomplicated joys. But perhaps the most defining aspect of Oprah's personal life was her commitment to stillness. In a world that never stopped moving, she made space for quiet reflection. Meditation was a daily practice, a way to center herself before the demands of the day took over. She believed in the power of gratitude, often keeping a journal where she would write down the small blessings of each day, a kind word from a friend, the way sunlight spilled across her bedroom floor in the morning, the taste of fresh fruit from her garden. These moments, she knew, were the threads that wove together a meaningful life. Her friendships were deep and enduring, built on honesty, trust, and a shared understanding of life's ups and downs. Gail King, her closest friend, was like a sister to her, their bond unshakable through decades of laughter, tears, and countless late-night phone calls. They didn't need to be doing anything extraordinary to enjoy each other's company. Sometimes, the most memorable moments were the quiet ones, sitting together on the couch, flipping through magazines, or reminiscing about old times. Oprah's personal philosophy was rooted in the belief that life was about becoming, not arriving. She didn't see herself as a finished product, but as someone always evolving, always learning. Even in her later years, she embraced new experiences, whether it was taking up a new hobby, like gardening, or diving into a subject she knew nothing about just for the joy of discovery. She often said that curiosity was the key to staying young at heart, and she lived that truth every day. As night falls and the world grows still, it's easy to imagine Oprah in her favorite chair, a book in her hands, the soft light of a lamp casting a warm glow around her. The house is quiet, the dogs asleep at her feet, the scent of jasmine drifting in through an open window. This was her happiness, not the fame, not the accolades, but the quiet, ordinary moments that made up a life well lived. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let the image of her peace settle over you like a soft blanket. Think of your own quiet joys, the small rituals that bring you comfort, the people who make your life richer just by being in it. Like Oprah, you are part of a story much larger than yourself, and every moment, every connection is a thread in the tapestry. Rest now, knowing that life's truest gifts are often the simplest, the love that surrounds you, the peace that fills you, and the quiet promise of another day to savor it all. Sleep well, dear one, and dream of the beauty that awaits in the stillness. Like a gentle river flowing toward the sea, our story continues with the next meaningful chapter. Oprah Winfrey's days unfolded like a carefully composed symphony, each movement flowing seamlessly into the next, guided by intention and a deep respect for the rhythms of life. Even in her busiest years, she wove moments of stillness into her schedule, understanding that true productivity was rooted in balance. Let us drift gently through the cadence of her days, from the quiet hush of morning to the peaceful surrender of night. And in doing so, perhaps find inspiration for our own rituals of rest and renewal. In the earliest hours, long before the sun stretched its golden fingers across the sky, Oprah would rise. The world outside her window was still draped in darkness, the air crisp and untouched by the bustle of the day. She cherished this time, when silence wrapped around her like a second skin. Her mornings began not with urgency, but with reverence, a slow, deliberate awakening of mind and spirit. She might light a candle, its flickering flame casting soft shadows on the walls, or settle into a favorite chair with a journal, her thoughts spilling onto the pages in smooth, looping script. Gratitude was her compass. She often wrote down the blessings of her life, a practice that anchored her before the demands of the day could pull her in too many directions. Breakfast was a quiet affair, simple but nourishing steel-cut oats with a drizzle of honey, perhaps, or fresh fruit sliced with care. She ate mindfully, savoring each bite, the ritual of feeding her body as important as feeding her soul. If the weather permitted, she might step outside onto the dew-kissed grass, breathing in the scent of earth and blossoms, feeling the world come alive around her. The dogs, ever her faithful companions, would trail behind her, their tails wagging in quiet contentment. As the day brightened, her focus shifted to work. In her earlier years, this meant preparing for the Oprah Winfrey show, reviewing scripts, meeting with producers, and fine-tuning interviews that would later resonate with millions. Her office was a sanctuary of creativity, a spacious room with large windows that bathed everything in natural light. Books lined the shelves, their spines worn from frequent use, and on her desk, a vase of fresh flowers brought a touch of nature indoors. She worked with a pen in hand, underlining passages, jotting notes in the margins, her mind always reaching for deeper understanding. Even in the whirlwind of production, she maintained a sense of calm, pausing between meetings to take a deep breath or sip herbal tea from a favorite mug. Lunch was often shared with colleagues or friends, a time for connection as much as sustenance. She believed in the power of breaking bread together, of stories exchanged over a meal. The table might be set with colorful plates, a crisp salad, a loaf of warm bread, nothing extravagant, but everything infused with care. Laughter rippled through these moments, the kind that loosened shoulders and lightened hearts. Afternoons varied with the seasons of her life. In her later years, when the pace of television production eased, she might retreat to her garden, her hands sinking into the soil as she tended to roses or herbs. There was something deeply grounding about the earth, about the slow, patient work of nurturing growth. Other days, she'd lose herself in a book, the weight of it comforting in her lap, the words transporting her to other worlds. Or perhaps she'd settle into a cozy nook with a cup of tea, chamomile, or peppermint, letting the steam curl upward as she reflected on the day's lessons. Evenings were a gradual winding down. Dinner was often a simple affair, something lovingly prepared, a bowl of soup, a piece of grilled fish, vegetables roasted to perfection. She ate slowly, deliberately, the clink of silverware against porcelain, a gentle punctuation to the day. If she dined alone, she might play soft music in the background, the notes floating through the room like a lullaby. If in company, the conversation would meander, unhurried, the kind that lingers long after the plates are cleared. As night deepened, so did her rituals. A warm bath, perhaps, scented with lavender or eucalyptus, the water easing the tension from her muscles. She might apply a rich cream to her skin, the act a quiet affirmation of self-care. Then, wrapped in the soft embrace of her favorite robe, she'd move toward bed, the dogs following, their paws padding softly against the floor. Her bedroom was a haven of tranquility, a plush mattress with crisp, high thread count sheets, the pillows arranged just so. The lighting was dim, the air faintly perfumed with the subtle fragrance of vanilla or sandalwood. Before sleep, she might read a few pages of a novel, the words lulling her into relaxation, or simply lie still, listening to the whisper of the wind outside her window. Some nights, she'd practice a short meditation, her breath steady and slow, her mind releasing the day's weight. And then, with a sigh of contentment, she'd drift into sleep, wrapped in the quiet certainty that tomorrow would bring its own gifts, its own moments of becoming. As you imagine her there, peaceful and at ease, let your own body soften into the mattress, your breath deepening, your thoughts slowing. Just as Oprah found rhythm in her days, so too can you find comfort in the gentle cadence of rest. The night holds you now, tender and still, and somewhere beyond the horizon, dawn waits patiently, ready to begin again. Sleep, dear one, and dream. As your thoughts grow quieter, we'll continue our peaceful exploration of this fascinating life. Oprah Winfrey's philosophy is like a slow, steady river, deep, expansive, and endlessly flowing, shaped by the currents of her life. From the earliest days of her childhood in rural Mississippi, she carried within her a quiet knowing, a sense that life was more than what met the eye. Even then, she understood that stories had power, that words could heal, and that every person carried a light within them, waiting to be seen. Her belief in the power of intention and purpose was not something she learned overnight. It was a truth that unfolded gently, like the petals of a flower opening to the morning sun. Those words were like seeds planted in the fertile soil of her spirit, growing into an unshakable belief in her own worth, and in time, the worth of every person who crossed her path. One of the cornerstones of Oprah's worldview is the idea that we are all connected, that every action, every word, ripples outward in ways we may never fully see. It was a philosophy born not just from success, but from struggle. The hardships of her early years, poverty, abuse, loss, taught her that resilience was not just about survival, but about transformation. She didn't just endure. She learned to alchemize pain into wisdom, to turn wounds into windows through which she could see the world with greater compassion. As she grew, so did her understanding of what it meant to live with intention. She often spoke of the whispers of life, those quiet nudges from the universe that guide us toward our purpose. Ignoring them, she believed, only led to louder and louder signs, until life had no choice but to get our attention. It was this deep trust in the unfolding of things that allowed her to move through the world with a rare kind of grace. Even in moments of uncertainty, her career was not just a series of jobs, but a living expression of her values. The Oprah Winfrey Show became more than a television program. It was a space where people felt seen, heard, and valued. She had an uncanny ability to listen, not just with her ears, but with her whole being. Guests often remarked that sitting across from her felt like sitting with someone who truly understood them, even if they had just met. This was no accident. Oprah believed that every person's story mattered, that in sharing our truths, we give others permission to do the same. One of her most enduring principles was the idea of gratitude as a way of life. Long before gratitude journals became popular, she was writing down the things she was thankful for each day. It wasn't about material wealth, though that came too. It was about the richness of spirit, the ability to find joy in the smallest moments, a sunrise, a kind word, the warmth of a cup of tea held between her hands. She understood that gratitude was not just a feeling, but a practice, something to be woven into the fabric of daily life. Her spiritual journey was just as integral to her philosophy as her professional one. She spoke openly about her faith, though it was never confined to a single tradition. She drew from Christianity, Buddhism, the teachings of Maya Angelou, the wisdom of Eckhart Tolle, always searching, always expanding. For her, spirituality was not about dogma, but about becoming more fully herself, and in doing so, helping others do the same. Even her approach to wealth and success was rooted in a deeper belief. She didn't see money as an end, but as a means, a tool to create change, to lift others up. Her philanthropy was never performative. It was an extension of her heart, from building schools in South Africa to funding scholarships for students in need. She believed that true abundance was meant to be shared. As the years passed, her philosophy only deepened, like roots growing stronger beneath a mighty tree. She embraced the idea that life was a series of lessons, and that even the hardest moments were teachers in disguise. Turn your wounds into wisdom, she advised, a lesson she had lived firsthand. She understood that growth was not linear, that some days would feel like setbacks, but that every experience, every joy, every sorrow was part of the tapestry of becoming. And perhaps most beautifully, Oprah's worldview was never static. It was alive, breathing, shifting as she did. She remained a student of life, always curious, always open, and in living hers, she gave others permission to imagine and then create their own. Now, as you rest here, wrapped in the quiet of the night, let these thoughts drift over you like a soft blanket. There is comfort in knowing that life, like Oprah's journey, is not about perfection, but about presence. Not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions. And just as she found her way through faith, through failure, through the quiet whispers of her soul, so too can you. Let your breathing slow, your body settle. The night is gentle, and the stars above are like distant reminders that we are all part of something vast, something sacred, and in this moment, there is nothing to do but rest, trusting that tomorrow, like Oprah, you will rise again, ready to listen, to learn, and to live. Sleep now, dear one, and dream, with each breath becoming slower and deeper. Let us turn to another aspect of this soothing story. Oprah Winfrey's path to becoming one of the most influential figures in the world. was not a straight line. It was a winding road, marked by deep valleys and steep climbs. Yet it was in these moments of struggle that she discovered her strength, her voice, and the unshakable faith that would carry her forward. As you rest here, let the story of her resilience wash over you like a slow, steady river, reminding you that even the darkest nights give way to dawn. Her earliest years were shadowed by hardship. Born into poverty in rural Mississippi, raised by a grandmother who taught her to read before the age of 3, Oprah knew both the warmth of love and the sting of lack. But even as a child, she carried within her a quiet certainty that her life was meant for more. When she was sent to live with her mother in Milwaukee, the stability she had known fractured. The bright, curious girl who had once recited Bible verses in church found herself navigating a world that felt unsafe. She endured abuse, neglect, and the crushing weight of being told she was not enough. Yet even then, she clung to the belief that her voice mattered. At 14, she became pregnant, a moment that could have derailed her entirely. The baby, born prematurely, did not survive, and in her grief, Oprah could have let despair define her. Instead, she made a choice. She would not let her circumstances dictate her future. With a fierce determination, she focused on her education, winning a scholarship to Tennessee State University. It was there, while studying communication, that she first felt the spark of possibility. Radio, then television, called to her, a place where her words could reach beyond the walls that had once confined her. Her first job in media was far from glamorous. She worked at a small local radio station, her voice carrying the news to a handful of listeners. But she approached each broadcast with the same passion she would later bring to millions. When she moved to television as a co-anchor, she faced another kind of challenge, the pressure to conform. Producers told her she was too emotional, too unpolished, too much herself. For a time, she tried to shrink, to fit into the mold of what a news anchor was supposed to be. But the more she resisted her natural warmth, the more she struggled. It was only when she stopped trying to be someone else that she began to rise. Here, at last, was a space where her authenticity could shine. She asked questions not as a detached journalist, but as someone genuinely curious about the lives of others. The audience responded, and ratings soared. But even success carried its own tests. When she was recruited to host a failing Chicago talk show, AM Chicago, she arrived in a city where she knew no one, stepping into a time slot that trailed far behind the competition. Many would have seen it as a hopeless cause. Oprah saw it as a blank page. Within months, she transformed the show. She spoke to her guests and her viewers as if they were friends gathered in her living room. She laughed with them, cried with them, asked the questions no one else dared to ask. The show, soon renamed The Oprah Winfrey Show, became a phenomenon. But with fame came scrutiny, criticism, and the weight of expectation. There were missteps, segments that missed the mark, interviews that drew backlash. Once, after a controversial episode, she lay awake at night, wrestling with doubt. Had she failed? Had she let people down? But instead of retreating, she listened. She learned, and she made a promise to herself. She would never again sacrifice truth for ratings. In the years that followed, she built an empire, a magazine, a network, a school for girls in South Africa. But even then, challenges found her. Her own network struggled in its early years, bleeding money and facing harsh reviews. Some whispered that she had finally overreached. But Oprah had lived through harder storms. She recalibrated, recentered, and trusted her vision. Slowly, the tide turned. Through it all, she carried the lessons of her struggles like precious stones. She learned that failure was not the opposite of success. It was part of it. That vulnerability was not weakness, but the doorway to connection. That the voice inside her, the one that had whispered to her even in the darkest times, was the one she needed to trust above all others. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let her story remind you that obstacles are not roadblocks. They are invitations to grow. That every setback carries within it the seed of a comeback, and that the most profound triumphs often begin in the quiet moments when we choose, against all odds, to believe in ourselves. Breathe deeply now and rest. The same strength that carried Oprah through her trials lives within you, too, ready to rise when the time comes. Sleep well and dream of resilience. The tapestry of this remarkable life unfolds further as we gently explore the next meaningful period. Beneath the bright lights and the roar of applause, there exists another Oprah one who finds stillness in the quiet corners of life, who cherishes the small, uncelebrated moments as much as the grand triumphs. Few know, for instance, that she has a deep, almost meditative love for gardening. There is something sacred to her in the act of pressing seeds into soil, in waiting patiently as life unfurls in its own time. On her property in Montecito, she tends to rows of lavender, their fragrant purple blossoms swaying in the coastal breeze. The rhythm of pruning, watering, and watching things grow grounds her, a gentle counterbalance to the whirlwind of her public life. She once confessed in an interview that some of her clearest thinking happens not in boardrooms, but with her hands in the earth. The simplicity of it, the way a plant will thrive if given the right conditions, the way it will lean stubbornly toward the light, reminds her of her own journey. Even now, after decades in the spotlight, she finds comfort in these quiet rituals. On mornings when the world feels heavy, she slips outside before dawn, the grass cool underfoot, and listens to the soft hum of the waking garden. Then there is her love of baking, a skill she honed not for fame, but for the sheer joy of creating something warm and nourishing. There is something profoundly human in the act of measuring flour, cracking eggs, filling a kitchen with the scent of cinnamon and butter. It's a reminder that even the most extraordinary lives are built on ordinary moments. And speaking of ordinary joys, few would guess that Oprah is an avid crossword puzzler. She loves the challenge of fitting words together, the satisfaction of a completed grid. It's a habit she picked up during her early days in television, a way to unwind between takes. To this day, she keeps a stack of puzzle books by her favorite reading chair, her pencil moving steadily across the page. There's something soothing in the predictability of it, the way every clue, no matter how tricky, has an answer waiting to be found. Her private library is another sanctuary, floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with books she has collected over a lifetime. But here's the surprising thing. She doesn't just read them. She talks to them. If a passage moves her, she'll scribble notes in the margins, underline sentences, as if in conversation with the author. Her copies of Maya Angelou's works are especially well loved. The pages filled with her looping handwriting, questions, reflections, moments of recognition. Reading, for her, is never passive. It's a dialogue. Even her relationship with fame holds contradictions. Though she is one of the most recognized faces in the world, she cherishes anonymity when she can find it. There's a story she tells about slipping into a small bookstore in a town where no one expected her. For a few blissful hours, she browsed undisturbed, her fingers trailing over spines, the quiet only broken by the occasional creak of the wooden floors. The owner, an elderly woman, never looked up from her knitting. It was, Oprah later said, one of the most peaceful afternoons she could remember. Then, there's her unexpected talent for mimicry. Close friends know that she can flawlessly recreate the voices of celebrities, politicians, even characters from old TV shows. It's a skill she rarely shows in public, reserved for moments of laughter among trusted companions. Her impression of Diana Ross, complete with the signature breathy vibrato, is said to be uncanny. But more than the talent itself, it's the joy she takes in it that's revealing. The way she dissolves into giggles mid-performance, the way she uses humor to connect. And connection, perhaps, is at the heart of all these hidden facets. For all her accomplishments, what truly sustains her are the small, sincere exchanges, the shared meal, the handwritten note, the quiet walk with her dogs. She has been known to strike up conversations with strangers in line at the grocery store, not as Oprah the icon, but as a woman who genuinely wants to hear their stories. Once on a flight, she spent hours listening to a young mother talk about her fears and dreams, offering no advice, just presence. That, too, is a kind of greatness, the ability to make others feel seen. Even her spirituality holds surprises. While she's spoken openly about her faith, few know about her fascination with the night sky. On clear evenings, she'll sometimes step outside, tilt her head back, and lose herself in the constellations. The vastness of it humbles her, puts everything into perspective. She finds comfort in the thought that the same stars shone over her grandmother's porch in Mississippi, over the cotton fields where her ancestors toiled, over every moment of her own improbable journey. And so, as you drift toward sleep, let these quieter truths about opera settle over you like a soft blanket. She is, after all, as human as anyone, a woman who finds joy in baking, solace in books, wonder in the stars. Her life, like yours, is made up of countless small moments, each one a thread in the larger tapestry. And if someone so extraordinary can cherish the ordinary so deeply, perhaps there's permission in that for you, too, to savor the quiet, to honor the small joys, to find magic in the mundane. Breathe deeply now and rest. The same quiet strength that guides her through lavender fields and crossword puzzles lives in you, too, in the ordinary moments that make up a life. Sleep well and dream of small, beautiful things as you settle more comfortably. Our narrative flows onward like soft moonlight across still waters. To understand the world Oprah Winfrey was born into, we must drift back to the year 1954, a time when the air hummed with both possibility and tension. The post-war era was unfolding, with America caught between the gleaming promise of progress and the deep shadows of inequality. It was the year of Brown v. Board of Education, when the Supreme Court declared school segregation unconstitutional, a ruling that would ripple through the country, slowly, unevenly, like the first drops of rain on parched earth. Yet in Kosciuszko, Mississippi, where Oprah took her first breath on January 29th, the old ways clung stubbornly to the soil. The cotton fields stretched for miles, their white tufts whispering of a history not yet fully reckoned with. The South of Oprah's childhood was a place of contradictions. The civil rights movement was gaining momentum, a quiet storm building strength. Rosa Parks had refused to give up her seat just a year before Oprah's birth, and Dr. King's voice was beginning to rise above the noise, calling for justice with a cadence that felt both new and ancient. But in the rural corners of Mississippi, Jim Crow's shadow lingered. Oprah's early years were spent under the care of her grandmother, Hattie Mee, in a home with no running water or electricity, a humble beginning that would later shape her understanding of resilience. The nights were lit by kerosene lamps, the sky outside a vast, star-studded canvas, the same one her ancestors had looked upon in moments of weariness and wonder. As the 1960s unfolded, so too did the world around young Oprah. Television sets began to flicker in more homes, broadcasting images of marches and sit-ins, of fire hoses and police dogs turned on peaceful protesters. The world was changing, and though she was just a child, these currents would later inform her sense of purpose. By the time she moved to Milwaukee to live with her mother, the decade's turbulence was in full swing. The assassinations of Malcolm X, then Dr. King, then Robert Kennedy, each loss sending shockwaves through the nation. Yet even in the midst of such upheaval, there were pockets of joy. Motown records spun on radios, their rhythms irresistible. a reminder that Black culture was not just surviving, but thriving, creating beauty even in hardship. The 1970s brought opera to Nashville, where she attended Tennessee State University. It was the era of Watergate, of growing disillusionment with authority, but also a time when women and people of color were pushing further into spaces long denied to them. The feminist movement was gaining ground, and though opera wouldn't call herself an activist in those days, her very presence, a young Black woman excelling in broadcasting, was its own quiet revolution. Radio was her first love, the intimacy of voice speaking directly to listeners, a skill she would later perfect on television. When she landed her own talk show in 1984, the world was entering a new phase of globalization and technological change. Reaganomics reshaped the economy. MTV brought music into living rooms with a new immediacy, and the AIDS crisis cast a long shadow over the decade. Yet, opera's show became something unexpected, a place of raw, unfiltered conversation, where guests spoke openly about abuse, addiction, and redemption. In an era often remembered for excess and artifice, her authenticity stood out. She didn't just interview people, she listened, really listened, and in doing so, gave permission for millions to do the same. The 1990s saw her influence grow, her book club turning obscure titles into bestsellers with a single mention. J. Simpson trial, the Oklahoma City bombing, but also of hope, with Nelson Mandela's release and the end of apartheid. Through it all, opera's voice remained steady, a reminder that personal stories mattered, that healing was possible. By the time she launched her own network in the 2010s, the media landscape had fractured into 1,000 channels and streams. Yet, her ability to connect never wavered. And so, as you let these thoughts drift over you, remember that opera's story is woven into the fabric of these times, a witness to history, yes, but also a shaper of it. The stars she gazes at now are the same ones that watched over her as a child, as a young woman finding her voice, as a leader who redefined what was possible. And just as those stars remain constant, so too does the quiet truth that ordinary moments, reading a book, baking a cake, looking up at the night sky, are the threads that bind us all. Let that thought carry you into sleep, gentle and sure as the turning of the earth under those same unchanging stars. Let the rhythm of these words carry you further into relaxation as we continue our peaceful journey. There was something almost magical in the way Oprah Winfrey entered the living rooms of millions, not as a distant figure on a screen, but as a presence that felt like an old friend. In the 1980s, when television was filled with glitz and excess, she chose a different path, one of quiet honesty, where the unspoken could finally be said aloud. Her show became a refuge, a place where people shared their deepest pains and triumphs without fear of judgment. This was no small thing in a world that often rewarded surfaces over substance. Slowly, without fanfare. She changed the way people saw themselves and each other. One of the most profound ways she shaped culture was by making the personal universal. Before her, talk shows often leaned into spectacle, dramatic revelations, heated confrontations. But Oprah turned the lens inward, asking quieter questions, allowing silence when it was needed, letting a guest's tears speak as loudly as their words. It was radical in its simplicity. When she spoke about her own struggles, her childhood poverty, the abuse she endured, her battles with weight and self-worth, she gave others permission to do the same. There was a ripple effect, a softening of public conversation, as if the culture itself exhaled. Her book club, launched in 1996, was another quiet revolution in an era when reading was becoming a solitary act. She made it communal. A single mention from her could turn an obscure novel into a bestseller overnight, not because she demanded it, but because people trusted her. She didn't just recommend books. She talked about them as if they were old friends, revealing how they moved her, changed her. Readers followed, not out of obligation, but because they wanted to feel what she felt. Authors like Toni Morrison, Wally Lamb, and Sue Monk Kidd found new audiences, their stories woven into the fabric of everyday lives. The act of reading became something shared, a thread connecting strangers across cities and time zones. But perhaps her greatest cultural impact was in the way she redefined success itself. In a world obsessed with wealth and fame, she spoke openly about meaning, about how true fulfillment came not from external validation, but from purpose, from service. Her philanthropic efforts were never just about writing checks. They were about building schools, mentoring young leaders, creating opportunities where none existed before. Her Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa was not just a school, but a statement that potential exists everywhere, waiting only for someone to believe in it. Over time, public perception of her shifted from mere celebrity to something closer to a moral compass. She was not without criticism, of course. No one who shapes culture so deeply escapes scrutiny, but even her detractors could not deny her influence. When she endorsed Barack Obama in 2008, her support carried weight not because she was a political expert, but because people trusted her judgment. She had spent decades listening, learning, and speaking from a place of deep empathy, and that mattered. As the years passed and media fractured into endless streams and algorithms, her presence remained a constant. She adapted without losing herself, launching her own network, producing films, hosting interviews that still felt like conversations. Even as the world grew louder, her voice stayed steady, a reminder that some truths are timeless. And now, as you drift towards sleep, think of all the lives she touched, not just the famous ones she interviewed, but the ordinary people who saw themselves in her words, who found courage in her story. Her legacy is not just in the awards or the records broken, but in the quiet moments when someone, somewhere, felt a little less alone because of something she said or did. That is the true measure of a life well lived, not the noise it makes, but the silence it fills with meaning. So, let your thoughts settle like soft snowfall. Each memory of her influence, a gentle flake, adding to the whole. The world is different because she was in it. And though the stars above remain unchanged, the way we see them and ourselves has been forever altered. Rest now, knowing that even in stillness, her impact lingers, as quiet and sure as the turning of the earth. With the gentleness of falling snow, we transition now to another meaningful chapter in this life story. There are moments in Oprah Winfrey's life so tender, so quietly revealing, that they feel like whispered secrets between friends. One such moment came long before the bright lights of television, back when she was just a young girl in rural Mississippi. Even then, she had a way with words, a way of holding people's attention without trying. Her grandmother, Hattie Me, would often find her on the porch, reciting Bible verses or inventing stories for the chickens pecking in the yard. "Somebody's going to listen to you one day," Hattie Me would say, not knowing just how many somebodies there would be. Years later, when Oprah was just starting out in local radio, there was a day when the station's usual host called in sick. The manager, hesitant to put the young intern on air, reluctantly handed her the microphone. It was one of those small, unplanned moments that set her on the path to something far greater. Then there was the time, early in her television career, when she interviewed a woman who had survived a house fire. The woman spoke softly, her hands trembling, and instead of rushing to the next question, Oprah simply waited. Oprah reached out and took her hand. "You're not," she said. No script, no dramatic music, just a moment of pure human connection. That became her gift, the ability to make people feel seen in a way that transcended the screen. Even in her rise to fame, she carried with her the lessons of her childhood. One of her favorite stories to tell was about the Sunday mornings she spent in church, where the preacher's voice would rise and fall like waves, and the congregation would sway together in rhythm. She once said that's where she learned the power of a story well told, how it could lift people up, carry them somewhere new. That's why, years later, when she started her book club, she didn't just pick bestsellers. She chose stories that made readers feel something, that stayed with them long after the last page. There were lighter moments, 2 little flashes of joy that showed her playful side, like the time she surprised her audience with a car giveaway, her laughter ringing out as she handed over the keys, or the day she convinced Tom Cruise to jump on her couch. An unscripted burst of excitement that became one of television's most talked about moments. But even in the midst of the whirlwind, she never lost sight of what mattered behind the scenes. She had a way of making everyone feel valued. Crew members still talk about how she remembered their names, asked about their families, brought homemade banana bread to the set just because. Once, during a break in filming, she noticed a young intern sitting alone, looking overwhelmed. It wasn't for the cameras. It was just who she was. And then there were the quiet acts of kindness few ever saw. The scholarships she funded without fanfare. The families she helped during holidays. The letters she answered by hand. She once paid for a stranger's groceries simply because the woman looked tired, slipping away before anyone could thank her. "We don't do kindness for applause," she later said. Even in her greatest successes, she remained grounded. When she launched her own network, there were struggles, moments of doubt. But she would think back to her grandmother's porch, to the chickens and the Bible verses, and remind herself that every journey begins with a single step. And when the network finally found its footing, she didn't celebrate with champagne or parties. She sat in her favorite chair, wrapped in a blanket, and simply breathed. Now, as you drift toward sleep, imagine all these moments like fireflies in the dark, tiny but bright, flickering with warmth, the stories, the laughter, the quiet acts of love. They weave together into something larger, something that lingers long after the spotlight fades. That's the magic of a life like hers, not in the grand gestures, but in the small, steady light it leaves behind. So let your thoughts soften, your breathing slow. Picture her voice, steady and sure, like a hand guiding you home. The world is full of noise, but here in the quiet, her words still echo. You matter, and as sleep wraps around you, remember that truth, like her legacy, is timeless. As your eyelids grow heavier, we'll softly explore another dimension of this fascinating biography. As the years softened the edges of her public life, Oprah Winfrey stepped back from the relentless pace of daily television, but never from the work that defined her. The later chapters of her life unfolded like the quiet turning of pages in a well-loved book, each one deliberate, meaningful, full of reflection. She no longer needed to chase the next big thing. Instead, she cultivated what she had built, tending to her legacy like a gardener, tending to a thriving, ancient tree. The roots ran deep, and the branches stretched wide, offering shade and shelter to countless souls who found comfort in her words. Her final projects were not about reinvention, but refinement. She returned to the medium that had first captured her imagination as a child, books. Through her book club, she continued to amplify voices that might otherwise have gone unheard. Her recommendations carrying the same weight they always had. A single mention from her could still send a novel soaring to the top of bestseller lists. But what mattered more was the conversations those books sparked. In living rooms, book clubs, and online forums, people gathered to discuss stories that challenged them, moved them, made them feel less alone. That, to her, was the real magic, not the fame or the influence, but the connection. She also turned her attention to education, pouring her resources into the school she had founded in South Africa and supporting scholarships for underprivileged students in the United States. Education had been her own lifeline, the thing that pulled her from poverty and into a world of possibility. And she never forgot that. The faces of the girls at the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy, bright with hope, fierce with determination, were a living testament to what she believed in. That talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And so she worked, quietly and steadily, to change that. The public still hung on her every word, though she spoke less frequently. When she did, it was with the measured wisdom of someone who had spent a lifetime listening. Her interviews were no longer daily events, but rare, cherished moments, like finding a letter from an old friend. She sat with world leaders, artists, and thinkers, her questions as insightful as ever, her presence a calming force in an increasingly chaotic world. Even in her later years, she had the rare ability to make people feel truly seen, as if the spotlight wasn't on them, but with them, a shared warmth in the dark. Awards and honors continued to find her, though she never sought them. The Presidential Medal of Freedom, honorary degrees, lifetime achievement accolades. They piled up like autumn leaves, beautiful but fleeting. What lingered was the way she spoke about them, always deflecting the praise onto the people who had shaped her, the teachers who had believed in her, the audience who had trusted her. Humility, she often said, was not about thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. And so, even in her triumphs, she turned the focus outward. At home, her life was simple in the way that only a well-lived life can be. She found joy in small things, the weight of a book in her hands, the sound of the ocean outside her California estate, the laughter of friends around a dinner table. She gardened, not because she had to, but because she loved the quiet rhythm of it, the way tending to the earth grounded her. Her dogs, always a constant in her life, trailed after her, their loyal presence a comfort. And when the sun set, she would often sit on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, just as she had been all those years ago when her network first found its footing, and simply breathe. The world, of course, still wondered what she would do next. But Oprah had learned the value of stillness. She had spent decades giving her energy, her time, her heart, and now, in these later years, she allowed herself to receive, to rest, to reflect. She often spoke about the importance of knowing when to close one chapter and begin another, not out of obligation, but out of respect for the journey itself. And what a journey it had been, from a child in rural Mississippi to one of the most influential women in the world. Her story was not just one of success, but of resilience, of grace, of an unshakable belief in the power of human connection. She had built empires, but more importantly, she had built bridges between people, between ideas, between the past and the future. Her legacy was not just in what she had achieved, but in the lives she had touched, the minds she had opened, the hearts she had healed. As the years drifted by like clouds across a wide, open sky, she became less a public figure and more a presence, a voice that still resonated in the quiet moments when people needed it most. Her words, her lessons, her stories, they lived on, passed down like heirlooms from one generation to the next. Young journalists cited her as their inspiration. Activists carried her messages of empowerment into their work. Everyday people, sitting on their own porches or curled up in their own chairs, remembered the way she had made them feel. Valued, understood, capable of more than they had ever imagined. And so, as you let your thoughts drift now, imagine her as she was in those later years, content, at peace, her life a tapestry woven with threads of struggle and triumph, sorrow and joy. Picture her smiling softly, knowing that her work was never really about her, but about the light she helped others find within themselves. The world may have given her fame, but she gave the world something far greater, the reminder that every life has meaning, that every story deserves to be told. Now, as sleep draws nearer, let that thought settle over you like a gentle sigh. The day's noise fades, the room grows softer, and somewhere, in the quiet spaces between wakefulness and dreams, her voice lingers, steady, sure, whispering the same truth she spent a lifetime sharing. You matter, your story matters. And with that, you can rest, knowing that some legacies never fade. They simply become part of the air we breathe, the light we carry, the quiet hum of the world turning, ever onward, ever hopeful. The gentle cadence of our story continues, flowing like a peaceful stream through the next chapter. Even now, long after the cameras stopped rolling and the headlines shifted to other names, Oprah Winfrey's presence lingers, soft, steady, like the hum of a familiar melody, played just beneath the surface of daily life. Her influence did not fade so much as it settled, seeping into the foundations of how we understand storytelling, empathy, and the quiet power of being seen. It is there, in the way young women speak with unshakable conviction about their worth, in the way activists frame their causes with personal narratives, in the way teachers encourage their students to listen not just with their ears, but with their hearts. Her legacy is not a monument to be visited, but a current, always moving, always shaping the world in ways both seen and unseen. Consider the journalists who grew up watching her, absorbing the way she leaned in, the way she made space for voices that had been ignored. Many of them carry that same intentionality into their work today, whether they're reporting on systemic injustice or interviewing someone about their ordinary, extraordinary life. They learned from her that a story is more than facts. It is the breath and heartbeat of the person telling it. Podcast hosts, too, trace their style back to her, to the way she could make a conversation feel like an intimate confession between friends. Even now, in the age of fleeting sound bites and viral clips, the ones who last are often the ones who remember her lesson. Connection is everything. And then there are the advocates, the organizers, the everyday people who took her message of empowerment and carried it forward like a torch. The Me Too movement, for instance, drew from the same well of courage that opera had tapped into decades earlier, the belief that sharing one's truth could change the world. Tarana Burke, who founded the movement, and the countless survivors who came forward, echoed opera's insistence that shame loses its power when stories are told in the light. It was no accident that when opera spoke at the Golden Globes in 2018, her words about speaking one's truth reverberated far beyond the room. She had spent a lifetime preparing the soil for that moment, teaching people how to listen, how to believe, how to rise. Her influence stretches, too, into the world of education and personal growth. The book clubs she championed were never just about reading. They were about seeing oneself in the pages, about the quiet transformation that happens when a story cracks open your heart. Today, online communities and reading groups still follow her model, creating spaces where literature is not just consumed, but lived. And the self-help movement, with its emphasis on intentional living and emotional honesty, owes much to her willingness to explore those topics long before they were mainstream. Therapists nod in recognition when clients quote something Oprah once said. Life coaches borrow her language of possibility. The idea that a person could rewrite their own story, that healing was not just possible, but necessary, became part of the cultural bloodstream because she insisted on it, gently, relentlessly. Of course, no legacy is static. Over time, some have questioned aspects of her approach, the focus on individual transformation over systemic change, the way her brand of empowerment sometimes blurred with consumerism. Critics point out that not everyone can dream big in the same way, that barriers of race, class, and circumstance require more than positive thinking to dismantle. And yet, even these challenges are a testament to her impact. She made the conversation about personal agency so central that it had to be wrestled with, refined, expanded. The activists who push for deeper structural reforms still stand on the ground she helped clear, the ground where people first believed they deserved more. Then there are the institutions, the tangible places where her influence took root. Her Leadership Academy for Girls in South Africa, for example, was never just a school. It was a living embodiment of her belief that education could lift entire communities. The young women who graduated from there carry her lessons forward, not as passive recipients, but as leaders in their own right, shaping their countries, their fields, their families, with the same fierce compassion they were taught. And closer to home, the scholarships, the donations, the quiet acts of generosity that never made headlines, they ripple outward in ways no one can fully measure. Perhaps most enduring, though, is the way she redefined what it meant to be a public figure long before social media made authenticity a buzzword. She showed that vulnerability could be a strength, that admitting doubt or pain did not diminish one's power, but deepened it. Today, when a celebrity speaks openly about mental health, or a politician shares a personal struggle, they walk a path she helped pave. The cultural shift toward emotional honesty, toward the messy, beautiful reality of being human, has her fingerprints all over it. And so, as the night deepens and the world outside grows still, her presence remains, not as a distant icon, but as a whisper in the wind, a reminder that the work of lifting others never really ends. It simply changes form, passing from one set of hands to the next. The young girl who watches an old clip of opera and feels seen for the first time, the teacher who uses her interviews to teach empathy, the parent who repeats her words like a mantra. You become what you believe. They are all part of the same unbroken chain, so let your breathing slow now. Let your thoughts drift like leaves on a quiet stream. Imagine, if you will, all those lives touched by her, all those stories still unfolding, each one a thread in the vast, shimmering tapestry she helped weave, and know that somewhere, in some corner of the world, someone is just now discovering her words, feeling that same spark of recognition, that same quiet certainty. Their story matters. That is how a legacy lives, not in grand gestures, but in the soft, steady light it leaves behind. And with that light glowing gently in the distance, you can close your eyes, rest, and trust that the world is still being shaped, still being softened by the echoes of all she gave. Sleep now, and let that thought carry you into dreams. Wrapped in the comfort of these words, we'll drift together into the next part of this soothing biography. There are many stories told about Oprah Winfrey, some true, some softened by time, some stretched into legend. And like any figure who has lived so fully in the public eye, her journey has been smoothed in places, made simpler than it ever really was. It is easy, after all, to take a life as vast as hers and turn it into a series of bright, polished moments, forgetting the quiet struggles, the unseen doubts, the slow growth that happened between the triumphs. But the truth, as always, is richer, deeper, and more human than the stories we tell. One of the most persistent myths is that Oprah's rise was effortless, that she was simply destined for greatness, as if her path was always clear, always assured. But this overlooks the years of stumbling, the doors that closed, the times she was told no. Before there was a national talk show, there were years of local news reporting, where she was deemed too emotional, where her depth of feeling was seen as a weakness rather than a strength. There were moments of uncertainty, of questioning whether she belonged in the spotlight at all. And yet, it was precisely that emotional honesty, that willingness to be vulnerable, that would later become her greatest gift. Another misconception is that she was always confident, always sure of herself. The truth is quieter, more relatable. Even at the height of her fame, she has spoken about the weight of expectation, the fear of letting people down. It is a small, human detail, one that reminds us that even those who seem fearless carry their own quiet doubts. Then there is the idea that Oprah's success was solely about her, that she alone built an empire through sheer force of will. But no one rises entirely on their own. There were mentors who believed in her early on, friends who steadied her, audiences who trusted her with their stories. There were also the countless guests who sat across from her, sharing their pain and joy, teaching her as much as she taught them. Her work was always a conversation, never a monologue. Some have simplified her message too, reducing it to easy affirmations. Just think positive, and everything will fall into place. But Oprah's philosophy was never about ignoring hardship. She spoke often about the importance of facing pain, of sitting with it, of learning from it. Turn your wounds into wisdom, she would say, acknowledging that growth is not about skipping the hard parts, but moving through them. Her words were not magic spells, but gentle invitations to do the slow, steady work of becoming. Even her famous book club, which many remember as a celebration of literature, was sometimes misunderstood. Critics dismissed it as mere entertainment, forgetting how deeply it changed the way people read. She didn't just recommend books. She made reading feel like a shared journey, a way to connect across differences. And in doing so, she reminded millions that stories matter, not just the ones on her show, but the ones we tell about ourselves. There are smaller myths, too, like the idea that her generosity was always grand, always public, but some of her most meaningful acts of kindness were quiet, unseen. Paying for a stranger's education, sitting with someone in their grief, listening long after the cameras stopped rolling. These were the moments that never made headlines, but were just as much a part of her legacy as the grand gestures. And then there is the way her faith has been framed. Some have assumed her spirituality was always serene, always certain, but she has spoken about wrestling with doubt, about searching for meaning in the face of suffering. Her faith was not a shield against life's storms, but an anchor within them, something she clung to, questioned, and rebuilt over time. Perhaps the biggest misconception of all is that Oprah's story is finished, that her impact is something we can neatly sum up. But the truth is, her influence is still unfolding in the young journalist who watches her old interviews for courage, in the activist who quotes her words at a rally, in the everyday person who hears her voice in their head when they need it most. Her legacy is not a monument, but a living thing, still growing, still reaching. So as the night deepens and the world grows quieter, let these thoughts drift over you like a gentle tide. The real Oprah, like any human being, was far more complex than the stories told about her. She was not just an icon, but a woman who laughed, who cried, who stumbled and rose again. And in that truth, there is a quiet comfort, a reminder that even the most extraordinary lives are made of ordinary moments, of small choices, of quiet perseverance. Rest now, and let the softer, fuller truth of her story settle around you. The myths may shine brightly, but the real beauty lies in the shadows, in the unseen struggles, in the quiet humanity that connects us all. Sleep, and know that even legends were once just people learning, growing, becoming. And in that thought, there is peace. Now, as we continue our gentle journey through this remarkable life, let us explore the next chapter as we come to the close of this quiet reflection on Oprah Winfrey's life. Let the weight of her journey sink softly into your thoughts, like the slow settling of sand at the bottom of a calm sea. Her story is not one of sudden triumphs or overnight success, but of gradual, persistent steps, each one carrying her forward, even when the path was unclear. From the small radio station in Nashville, where she first found her voice, to the global stage, where she became a beacon of hope for millions. Her life has been a testament to the power of resilience, intention, and an unshakable belief in the possibility of change. Think of how she sat across from guests on her talk show, her deep listening making strangers feel seen, her empathy transforming television into a space of healing. She didn't just conduct interviews, she held conversations that mattered, discussions about trauma, joy, injustice, and redemption. In those moments, she taught the world that vulnerability was not weakness, but strength, that sharing our stories could mend the fractures in our lives. Even now, decades later, those episodes remain a source of comfort and inspiration, their lessons echoing in the hearts of those who revisit them. And then there was her quiet but profound impact beyond the screen. Her book club didn't just sell novels. It reignited a love of reading in countless people, proving that stories could be both an escape and a mirror. Her philanthropic work, from building schools in South Africa to advocating for children's education, showed that success was not just about personal achievement, but about lifting others as you climb. She never forgot where she came from, the little girl in rural Mississippi who knew hunger, who knew hardship. And that memory fueled her determination to make the world a little kinder, a little fairer. Even now, as the years pass, her influence continues to ripple outward. Young journalists study her interviews, not just for her skill, but for the way she made space for truth. Entrepreneurs look to her as proof that a Black woman from humble beginnings could build an empire on her own terms. Everyday people, in moments of doubt or fear, still hear her voice whispering, "You are enough." That is the mark of a true legacy, not just what she did, but how she made people feel, how she helped them see themselves differently. And yet, for all her fame, she remained deeply human. In doing so, she reminded us that even those who seem invincible carry their own burdens, their own quiet battles. There is comfort in that, isn't there? The knowledge that no life, no matter how grand, is without its shadows. It makes her triumphs all the more meaningful, because they were hard-won, because they were real. As the night wraps around you now, let your breath slow, your thoughts soften. Imagine her story like a river, sometimes rushing, sometimes meandering, but always moving, always finding its way. And just as a river nourishes the land it touches, so too has her life nourished the world in ways both seen and unseen. The books read, the lives changed, the conversations started. These are the quiet currents of her legacy, still flowing, still shaping the world long after the cameras stopped rolling. So rest, dear listener, and let the warmth of this truth settle over you. Legends are not born. They are made one choice, one act of courage, one moment of kindness at a time. And in the quiet of this night, as sleep begins to claim you, remember that Oprah's story is not just hers alone. It belongs to all of us, to anyone who has ever dared to dream, to stumble, to try again. Close your eyes now and let the stillness carry you. The day will come again with its own stories, its own possibilities. But for now, drift softly into dreams, wrapped in the gentle certainty that even the grandest lives are made of small, sacred moments. And in that knowing, there is peace, deep, quiet peace. Sleep well.